Should we start?
Yeah.
Good afternoon. A very warm welcome to all the speakers and participants to this two-day orientation program to our fellowship initiative. We are overwhelmed by the response we received and hope that all of you take back with you some interesting insights and ideas for writing engaging stories from a gender perspective. Before I formally begin the session, I would like to quickly put down some ground rules for the smooth conduct of the session. May I please request all the participants to keep their audios on mute and videos on. Feel free to use the chat box for your questions or raise your hand if you want to ask a question or make a comment. Please note, we have a dedicated question and answer session after each session. I would now like to call Dr. A.L. Sharda and Population First, our Director for Population First, to make her opening remarks. Over to you, Dr. Sharda.
Thank you, Malti. A warm welcome to all of you for joining this two-day workshop. And this is as part of our fellowship initiative. Every year since 2011, we've been giving granting fellowships to media people, particularly only the print media. And since 2020, we have increased the number of fellowships from 4 to 15. So every year we are giving, 2020 we gave 16 fellowships, and in 2021 and now in 2022, we are once again giving 15 fellowships. The purpose of fellowships is not just to support monetarily the journalists, but also to create a group of media persons who are committed to writing gender-sensitive stories, to build their skills and to provide a supporting ecosystem for them to continue writing sensitive and nuanced stories on gender. So that is the objective, the purpose, because we realize that there are very few opportunities for media people, particularly from the regional media, to explore gender issues or gender related matters, because most of the journalism colleges do not give the required attention to gender studies or gender perspective in reporting. And also many organizations, many major media houses have in-house training program which supports or which provides training or insight training program modules on gender sensitivity. But many of the smaller publications, regional publications, they do not have that facility. And then we really need to build the skills and understanding and skills of the media people to write gender sensitive stories, because it's very, very important, particularly now in the post-COVID times when a lot has changed and many equations have changed. And then, we have gone back by at least 2 steps with regard to achieving the SDG goals, strategic development goals. So we really need to know how to write gender sensitive stories. As you all know, we have only 15 fellowships, but we have a large number of people attending the the workshop. So please treat this as an opportunity to learn more about gender and gender issues. If you get the fellowship, it's good. But if you don't get the fellowship, you can still use the insights in writing good stories, which are meaningful, which make a contribution to the society in some way, influencing the policies, influencing the mindsets. Remember, you are very influential. Whatever you write has an impact. If it is bad, people will complain. If it is good, they will appreciate. And you make people think. When I read an article, I say, oh, is it really so? I never thought about it this way. Or I say, how can that person miss this particular perspective in the writing? So you can change the mindsets. You can create political, you can provide political commentary, and you can also influence the policymakers and program managers. Because if you report on a particular a program or a policy in a very systematic way, in a very objective and in a very analytical way, it is bound to influence the policymakers and bring about some change somewhere. And we have the example of Nirbhaya case, and how the whole media responded to that has made some drastic changes in the way we look at rape and the way we interpret rape. So remember and be conscious of the power you have, and you can make a difference, small, big, moderate, but doesn't matter. But you will definitely, every time you write, you are making a difference. Remember that. And then write with that consciousness, being inclusive in your write-ups. Stop being guided by, usual run-of-the-mill kind of an approach to story writing. Now, with the opening up of the social media, you have so many more options, opportunities to publish your write-ups. You are not solely dependent on your publication. You can have your own blog, you can have your own website, you can have your own YouTube channel. There are so many, Twitters, Instagram, whatever it is. You can always express your views and your understanding in myriad ways across the media. So my only request or my only submission is that, understand the power you wield and exercise that power very responsibly to make a better world. Thank you so much. And thank you, Leena, for the initial session that you're taking, which is going to be which would be the foundation for this whole 2-day workshop on gender and patriarchy. And Leena is a very good friend and a supporter of Laadli. And I'm so glad that she's here to do the session today. And I also like to thank Professor Vibhuti Patel, Ms. Sameera Khan, and Srinidhi, who will be taking sessions after Leena. And all of you, please keep your pen and pencil. I'm very old-fashioned, so keep your pen and pencil with you. Jot down the notes. Otherwise, you think, I understood after half an hour, everything is gone from your brain, which is a fact. So it's very important when you're reading or writing to underline, write comments. It's a very old-fashioned way of doing it, but it is like pressing the enter button on the computer. If you don't press the save button, then everything is gone. So writing down is like pressing that save button. So Control S is what it is. So you write down, use a paper, pen. I know journalists do use, but nowadays everybody's gone to mobiles and nobody is writing much, but it is important that you write. So all the best, and I hope you all enjoy these sessions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Sharda. We would now like to invite Dr. Leena Pujari to take us through an understanding of gender and patriarchy. She is a feminist sociologist and researcher who believes in teaching for social transformation and in nurturing critical and analytical minds. Currently, she is Associate Professor and Head, Department of Sociology, Casey College. She specializes in gender studies and has been passionately involved for 2 decades in creating a gender-just and emancipatory space on campus. She has authored several publications. Over to you, Dr. Pujari.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Malti, for that kind introduction. Good afternoon to one and all present here. Director, Population First, Dr. Sharda, the team from Population First, all of you who are here, including Pooja, who has been coordinating with me, and of course, the participants of this particular program. And I can see so many of you. I saw what you wrote in the chat box, and it's so wonderful to know that we have a diverse audience here. And it's an absolute pleasure and honor to be here today. And thank you, Dr. Sharda, for inviting me. And of course, congratulations for running this wonderful fellowship program since 2011. And then, of course, I heard how you've increased the number of fellowships since 2022. And I was particularly sort of happy with with the way you kind of established the importance of this particular program for the participants, how you were talking about their responsibility, the part they wield, and I couldn't agree more with you. In fact, I'm so looking forward to interacting with them. And, I have always believed, and before I start, I must say this, that I've always believed that there are three important constituencies that are, so to say, the real change makers, besides, of course, a whole lot of them. But I've always believed the three important constituencies are academic activists, and of course, the media practitioners. But of these three, I think a lot of burden rests on media practitioners, simply because I think your reach is extensive. You can reach a wider audience. You can actually influence. That is what Dr. Sharda was telling you. And therefore, in that sense, you're very powerful. And it's important, therefore, that you exercise your power with, very responsibly, as she rightly said. And I don't think I can emphasize enough the importance of a workshop like this or a two-day program like this, and especially in terms of understanding gender and gender issues. And I must say that Population First has been doing wonderful work in this, very, very admirable work in this area. It's so important as media practitioners for you to sort of not just understand the diversity that we have in India in terms of socio-cultural factors, but also the diversity in terms of genders, multiple gender identities and how they actually play out. So I have been asked, of course, to speak on sex, gender, and patriarchy. So I've titled my presentations, which I'm going to share in a minute, as patriarchal structures and gender regimes and mapping intersections. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to maybe give you a very nuanced and complex understanding. And I'm going to take you through this journey of how these concepts, and as Dr. Sharda said, and something that I also thought, some of you might be familiar with some of this, what I'm going to speak about. But what I'm going to do is kind of complicate it a little bit for you and take you away from the very simplistic ways of understanding sex, gender, and patriarchy and how they have evolved over the years. And I'm going to speak for like 30 minutes or so. And then maybe 20 minutes we can have for interaction. And I think, so it's quite a vast expanse, and I don't think I can do justice to everything, but I will try my best. And probably some of the things can be taken up during the question answer session. So if I may just share my screen, just one sec. Yeah. Are you able to see my screen? Is it visible?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Okay. All right. So here it is: patriarchal structures and gender regimes mapping intersections. All right. So to begin, okay, I think I have also been made the host, but I don't think I have to admit people. Yeah. So traditionally, and if I may say this, so how have we looked at the concept of sex, gender, and patriarchy? In fact, in some of the countries and some of the universities across the world, the concept of, very often we use gender and patriarchy interchangeably, synonymously, as though they mean one and the same. And in some universities, in fact, they have replaced the term patriarchy with gender. So these are the different, what should I say, the politics of doing these kind of things in different universities as well. So, but traditionally, I mean, this is, of course, something that is also in the public domain. We have understood sex has largely been understood as referring to the biological differences between men and women, male and female. So, biological differences would be, for example, in terms of genitalia, in terms of chromosomes, in terms of hormones, right? And in fact, that the first piece of labeling that affects a newborn is the attribution of gender. I mean, everybody wants to know whether it's a male or female. Now, obviously, that is on the basis of the external genitalia, because we cannot see hormones, we cannot see chromosomes unless we do a blood test. So we go by that, right? So sex has largely been understood as a kind of biological differences, something that is rooted in our bodies per se. And gender has been understood as a social construction of those differences, So for example, when we use the terms masculine and feminine, so someone who's born a male is supposed to grow up as masculine, and someone who's born as a female is supposed to be imbued with qualities that are supposed to be feminine, right? That's how we have understood it. And interestingly, For a long time, if we go back into history, like if I'm talking about 4th century, then we're talking about 16th, 17th, 18th century, and those of you who are a little familiar with feminist acts of resistance, or rather, should I say, individual acts of resistance, and the history of feminism, for example, would know that those were the days when sex and gender were used synonymously. There was no difference between the two. In fact, the theory of biological determinism was very pronounced, right? Anatomy is destiny, right? So women have to do certain things because they have been born in a certain way, because they have ovaries, they have uterus. So, for example, child bearers alone can be child rearers, right? It was really difficult to explain that there's nothing extraordinary about child rearing that only a woman can do and a man can't do. Okay. So in order to kind of challenge this kind of assumption of anatomy is destiny, that is all about biological determinism. Okay, which is why you had this rigid division into public and private, and women were largely identified with the private space. And any attempt by women to transgress or to cross boundaries was seen as an aberration, and you risked, all kind of risk of being labeled as mad, being hysterical, put in asylums, and so on and so forth. And if time permits, I will get into that a little bit in the latter part of my presentation. So basically, to counter this kind of attempt to conflate sex and gender, feminists actually spoke about this difference, okay, to make for more enabling spaces for women. So they said the sex is one thing, that is something that we are born with, but that cannot be our destiny, right? And how we define men and women, how we see masculinity and femininity is a result of social construction, which is of course amenable to change. We should change and thereby create these enabling spaces. So that's how it all started, right?
Leena, could you please put it in presentation mode?
Okay. Is this okay now? Okay.
Yeah, now it is good.
All right. Okay. All right. So as I was saying, so what is the biology all about? The biology essentially is about three things: chromosomes, XX, XY, hormones, and genitalia, right? This is how we largely understood sex. Now, so we assumed a perfect correspondence. I mean, it was all very simple, straightforward, nice, not much to think about, perfect correspondence between sex and as gender and sexuality, right? So a person labeled as man will grow up into being masculine and will be romantically attracted to the opposite sex. So, man, masculine, and heterosexual. Very simple, clear, and easy, that a woman is supposed to be feminine and naturally attracted to a man, to someone of the opposite sex. And it was all very nicely established, these kind of binaries. However, this whole thing, this whole framework began to be interrogated because there were certain other things that were entering the scenario. There were certain complexities that were kind of coming into the picture. And so the debate had to be complicated. And that was the presence of individuals with intersex variations, okay? So what are these presence of individuals with intersex variation? What would that mean? So for example, there are many grays between XX and XY. So there are people who are born, and Anne Sterling, who is a gender studies expert and a biologist at one of the universities abroad. She said that 1 in every 1,000 children are born with what is known as ambiguous genitalia. Where it's not very clear. So for example, as I said, the first piece of labeling that affects a newborn is the attribution of gender. And that's very important. The first thing that we ask is boy or a girl, because that has to go on the certificate also, right? Birth certificate. Now, in some cases, this became problematic because some of the children were born with ambiguous genitalia, which would mean several kinds of things. It would mean the presence of both penis and vagina. It would mean a very clear penis, but inside a hidden vagina, so on and so forth, something which may not be visible at that point of time, and all other kind of variations. Now, in such cases, labeling took on a very arbitrary kind of dimension. I mean, it was left to, so for example, between parents and the doctors to decide how to label the child, okay, and what to label the child as, okay. And of course, there were different kind of permutations and combinations that entered the scene depending on whether the parents wanted a son or a daughter, so on and so forth. And such cases have also been reported in India. Now, or of course, we have something called women who are born with Turner syndrome, where they have O chromosome, where X0, where 0 actually indicates absence of a chromosome, right? So then there was, suddenly we realized that there was this dissonance between sexual anatomy and chromosomes or hormones. So how we looked, or externally what was visible, and inside, whether we had ovaries, whether we had uterus, whether we had testis. So there seemed to be a little bit of dissonance in terms of the external visibility, what was visible, and internal, that which was not visible, right? And when all of this, and I'm going to give you 3 case studies. And in fact, these are 3 case studies that you may have heard of, because these are sports persons, they are celebrities, but there are countless number of people, who are struggling with their gender identities, with understanding their sexual and gender identity. And so many of them also, I have seen them, they have been my students, and I've seen them grappling with this and trying to understand it, not being able to speak about it. These are the 3 case studies. You might have heard about Santi Soundarajan. She was a famous athlete, okay, and she won the 800-meter race at the Asian Games in Doha. This was in 2006, right? And after the event, 2 days after the event, she was asked to appear for a test, and she of course agreed. And she didn't ask what was the test for. And her victory was widely hailed, and the chief minister of Tamil Nadu announced that she's going to get a prize money and a house and all that. And of course, family was elated. Then after the test, 2 days later, she arrived in Chennai, and obviously she was expecting a wonderful reception, and she was a little surprised to see there was no one waiting for her at the airport. Anyway, she just went home. For 2 days, nothing really happened. She was still waiting for the plaudits to come her way. And then suddenly one afternoon, when she was watching television, she heard in the news that she had failed the sex test. And what happens when you fail the sex test? Apparently, she did not have the sexual characteristics typical of a woman, and she was competing in the women's category. And so there were questions asked about whether she was a man or a woman. She was stripped of her medal. She was stripped of everything that was promised to her. She became a recluse, considering the kind of brickbats that came her way. She literally lost everything. She ended up working as a bricklayer worker to survive, for her survival and for her family's survival. And her family was thoroughly confused and shocked. I mean, people didn't understand what was the issue. She was labeled as a woman. She grew up feeling, thinking, and acting like a girl, but she never got her periods. She never menstruated, but she was very agile, very active, and that's how she became an athlete. And she was trained very well. If I may tell you a little bit of history, the Olympics Association, International Olympics Association, introduced something called the sex test. This was as early as 1966. And the reason for introducing the sex test was because those were the days when there was this rumor that some communist men were masquerading as women and competing in the women's category, right? And that's when the sex test was introduced. Now, the sex test actually has taken on various forms over the years. Initially, it was extremely offensive, where women actually were paraded nude to see whether they had all the external characteristics typical of a woman, so to say, quote unquote. Then, of course, after criticism, it changed to something called bar test, where they would chip off something from the cheek. Anyway, I won't go into those details of the test, but what is important was she failed this, but of course, this test was after a lot of criticism. There was a lot of criticism of these kind of tests, which was happening within the International Olympics Association, of which they had mandated for all tournaments. All these tests were scrapped in 1999, exactly 32 years after they were instituted. However, the tests were conducted on a case-to-case basis now, depending on some kind of suspicion. If there was a suspicion, if there was a complaint, these tests, which is how Santi Soundarajan had to appear for the test in 2006, because a fellow runner complained about her, about the way she was being, about the way she was conducting herself, so on and so forth, right? Now, look at this. These are whole instances of misgendering, which problematize a very simplistic idea of sex and gender. Okay, the Martinez, of course, was a Spanish hurdler, and she was competing in 1988 at Kobe in Japan at the World Championships. She had actually, she was asked to, she had forgotten to carry her femininity certificate, which many athletes, carry with themselves just to play safe. And so she was asked to appear for the sex test, but the result was coming 2 days later. So she skipped the event and she came home. But the sex test results showed that she had a Y chromosome. And instead of having two X chromosomes, she had a Y chromosome. So she was labeled as a male and she was debarred from all future competition. But she fought back because she says that I have all along thought, felt, and acted like a woman. I have been labeled as a woman. And about all this tests, I have no idea. What is important is the way I feel. And her country also supported her and she made her way back. She subjected her body to a number of tests. And one of these tests showed that she suffered from something called androgen insensitivity syndrome, which meant she lacked her body lacked the receptors to identify androgen, which is a male hormone, right? And of course, the third case was Dakti Chand, a more recent case, the first sportswoman to declare that she is a lesbian. She was to compete, she was training for an event in Delhi and she was asked to appear for a sex test because somebody complained that she had unusual muscles, typical of a man and not a woman. And there was a problem with that test also, but Dakti, she could not board the flight to the tournament. She was disheartened, but she went to court. Okay, she went to court and finally, of course, the court ruling was in her favor. Now, I have just given you these three instances. And as I said, these are, of course, we know because they're famous, they're celebrities. There are many such that we do not know about. And what all three of them were saying is, we don't know about the tests. We don't know about biology. We don't know what's inside our body. But what is important is what we think about ourselves and how we affirm ourselves, right? A fact which God affirmed through the Nalsar judgment in 2014. And the Nalsar judgment is a very important judgment because it said that irrespective of these physical attributes, physical characteristics that are supposed to define sex, okay, and consequently your gender identity, what is important is what the person thinks about their gender, right? So gender is a matter of self-identification. It is not a matter of subjecting oneself to numerous tests so that whoever authorities of the state or whoever Olympic bodies or federations are convinced about your sexual identity, right? And then the question that arose was interesting. So, initially it seemed as though our sex caused our gender, right? So the way we were born, we were reared or we were raised to be masculine or feminine. But after these incidents and many more, the whole thing was reversed. And now the question that was asked was, isn't sex as much a process of social construction as gender? Right? And Judith Butler argues this very wonderfully. She says, instead of sex causing gender, we now know that gender is causing sex. Right? So, this process of labeling, which can be very arbitrary in case of those children who are born with ambiguous genitalia, which actually tells us that even your sexual identity is a matter of social construction. It's a society which is creating this kind of identity. Okay, and that bodies are diverse and we need to respect those diverse bodies. I will not get much into this because there are sessions thereafter which I'm sure will address these kind of issues. But therefore, you need to understand that what became very clear is sex is not a purely physical category. Right? And Fausto very beautifully sums it up. She says sex is a vast, and it is not just those 2 categories or 5 categories or 6 categories. She says it's a vast, infinitely malleable continuum that defies these 5 or 6 categories. Okay. Now, of course, then this now, so, initially when we taught sex and gender, we began with telling them about, this is sex, this is gender, physical, and this is social. We don't do it. Now, when we teach our students, we actually tell them about, how it's important to understand that both are processes of social construction. And, which is why I call this a gender regime. These are the two slots into which people are pushed into it. It's not about gender roles anymore. It's about these regimes. And these regimes are so firmly in place that any transgression is seen as an aberration, right? And you are targeted, stigmatized, labeled, so on and so forth. So the question that came was, how is it that only two genders have defined our understanding of the subject? What about those who do not identify either as men or women, either as male or female? Or what about those who reject the label that is given to them? If I may quickly recount an incident, because I do a lot of classroom ethnography and I learn a lot from students. I've always identified myself as a feminist teacher, and I have always looked at, many of our teachers, and I'm implicating myself in this whole debate. When we enter our classrooms, we generally tend to use male pronouns. So the subject invariably is a man, even when we are talking about women. Like Aristotle says, man is a social animal. In fact, that's another debate. All our anatomists, scientists, philosophers, all great people, Aristotle, Schopenhauer, Charles Darwin, our painters, the so-called intellectuals have been highly misogynist, okay? And they've all believed in this theory of anatomy is destiny, which is where in fact it comes from, right? So while I was doing all this, and I thought I was being actually very feminist by talking about men and women all the time and not centering men or using male pronouns, one day a student walked up to me and said, but ma'am, who are you actually referring to when you're talking about men and women? I think you're referring to cis men and cis women. And I said, yes. Then she says, it's important for you to mention that. And then the student said, but where do I belong? I identify neither as a cis man or a cis woman. I'm non-binary. So when you are constantly talking about he and she, I actually feel excluded because the classroom, but perhaps the class or the lesson is not being addressed to me. And that was, it marked an epiphany, it was a turning point. And I said, oh my God, and that's when the process of reflection started, and then one realized that your classroom then become exclusionary. They're no longer inclusive. So, which is very important. So even as journalists, when you write, this is something that we need to sort of foreground, center. And as I said, this is something that cannot be emphasized enough. You have to keep doing it over and over again. So therefore, all of us, including you, media practitioners especially, I think we need to speak to many more subjects, many more people, many more identities than just men and women, right? So there are multiple identities. So a very simplistic way of looking at this whole thing then was, was punctured, isn't it? Because then you knew that there could be multiple identities. So, I can be labeled as a man and I can be a cis man. I'm not rejecting my label, but I can be masculine, I can be feminine, I can be heteronormative, I can engage in same-sex behavior, conduct, I can be attracted, have romantic attraction towards someone of the same sex, right? And I can be a man, a cis man, I can be effeminate. The word effeminate is a problem. There are certain constructs, certain words, which I think have to be thrown out of the dictionary. Okay, it's extremely problematic to kind of look at it that way. But, this is an important learning that has come especially from queer students in my classes, that you can, what is important is to understand the idea of gender fluidity, and to understand the idea of a gender spectrum, okay? And the very important thing that your gender identities are not fixed, right? And they can change, they can shift. Okay. And so, if you can be sort of reflective and if you can sort of bring out these complexes and nuances in your writings, then you can actually enable shifts and you can construct a different kind of narrative, right? So So this is going beyond the binary. I've just listed down a few sexual identities. I'm not going to go into it because you have a session by Sridhar. I'm sure Sridhar will talk about it. So there can be a range of sexual identities, not limited to these. There are many more, and you can have a range of gender identities, and it is very important for you to, as media persons, to understand this, because very often when you do surveys, very often when you do a little bit of research work, and in your interview schedule, in your questionnaire, or in your interview guide, whatever you may use the research instrument, the gender part has to be spelled out clearly. Very often we say male, female, and other. That other is also problematic because you are clubbing so many identities in it, and that's not fair. Okay, when you make man and woman very clear, it's important for you to list out some other identities as well, and then have another component for them to self-identify, right? Okay, so let's not freeze identities. So that was a little bit about sex and gender. And we will take up, if you have questions, we'll take up during the discussion. And now coming to patriarchy. Okay, so, the sex, gender, patriarchy, and then of course we will see how these three concepts intersect with our other social locations to produce different kinds of vulnerabilities or experiences of privilege and oppression. Okay, but first a little bit about patriarchy. Now, what is patriarchy? I mean, you all would know, for example, the simplistic way of looking at it is patriarchy is male dominance, right? Patriarchy is basically a power relationship. Patriarchy is where men dominate. It's basically an idea that men are supreme, men are very, very important, and men have to be primary, women are secondary. These are the ideas. But I will just kind of tell you about what Bell Hooks says. Now, I'm sure many of you might know who Bell Hooks is. She passed away recently, and her loss, actually, her demise seemed like a personal loss, because she's the one who I'm so influenced by in my classroom teaching. And Bell Hooks says that she says patriarchy is basically a system that believes in men's dominance, right? That believes that men are primary, men are important, men are superior. They have to be superior, in fact. And most of the terms that we use in different languages to refer to husbands, Swami, Pati, and all of them in some ways refer to this idea of God, a supreme being, so on and so forth. And patriarchy essentially, patriarchy is like, patriarchy is so deep-rooted, so firmly entrenched in our society. And it's insidious, it's insidious because it's extremely difficult to recognize patriarchy, let alone fighting it. Fighting it is a different thing. It's very, very difficult to be conscious or to acknowledge that we're all patriarchal. And let me tell you, we are all patriarchal. In fact, Bell Hooks starts by saying, she says one of the reasons why feminism has become so unpopular is this idea that feminism is basically a movement about women trumping over men. This anti-men sentiment associated with feminism has made it so unpopular. And she said the first thing that we need to understand is women are as patriarchal as men. Or even those in gender marginal locations can be very patriarchal, right? I mean, patriarchy is a result of conditioning, and it is so deep-rooted. The way we have internalized misogyny, all of us. I mean, the entire society is patriarchal. All institutions are patriarchal. Surely some of us cannot be saints and say, no, we are not at all patriarchal. We are absolutely equal rights feminists and stuff like that. That doesn't work. What is important for each one of us is to understand how patriarchy manifests in our everyday lives, okay? And how it's important for us to be conscious of the ways in which it is happening. So I may not be able to eradicate it completely, but at least I'm conscious of it, then I know, then I'll be more guarded, as simple as that, right? And it is this patriarchy that essentially results in gendered regimes. This idea that men are dominant, men are supreme. And as I was mentioning about this at the start of the program, just before the program, actually, my talk began, I was talking about how, for me, there are multiple patriarchies. Patriarchy is not that men dominant kind of thing. For me, caste is patriarchal, religion is patriarchal, race, racism, caste, class, ableism. These are all patriarchal monsters that are all staring at us, okay? And, that we confront day in and day out of our lives. And of course, these interlocking systems, okay, caste, class, gender, sexual orientation, race, ableism, ethnicity, all of these are interlocking systems. And again, if I may just tell you a little bit, Bell Hooks, put this very beautifully. She said, feminism is not about equality between men and women, right? Because if you talk about equality between men and women, you will only talk about being like men, or you will only talk about equal pay for equal work. These are the kind of things. That is not what we are looking for in feminism. Feminism is more deep-rooted. Feminism is actually about looking at systemic exclusions, looking at systemic privileges, looking at how these patriarchal ideas have seeped into our very existence, into our very being, in our homes, in our everyday lives, in our schools, in our colleges, in our media houses, and how do they manifest themselves, right? And she says, no feminist should remain in this illusion that, if there is gender equality, we have achieved our aims. She says, certainly not. Obviously, if you have achieved gender equality, you will have other isms that continue, no? You think you will live in a wonderful place, or the world will be transformed just by bringing about gender equality? What about, you will still have to grapple with and deal with racism, casteism, classism, hyper-nationalism. I'm surely these kind of things do not make the world a better place to live in. So every feminist must therefore understand that we are looking at all kinds of transformations. So that's where the idea of multiple patriarchies come in. And of course, patriarchal structures that we see all around us. Every structure is patriarchal. Anything that is not, anybody can tell me if something is not gendered, something is not patriarchal, I would be, I will actually be shocked, because there's nothing around me that I've seen over so many years which is not patriarchal, right? It starts with the family, which is also heteronormative. You see the state, you see the family planning program, you look at the policies, a policy, even the state believes that men should be bread earners, that, women should be responsible for children. So you have a particular legislation which says that any factory which employs more than 100 workers, if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, but it says that any factory which employs more than 100 women workers will have to have a creche. It doesn't say that every factory which has more than 100 workers will have a creche attached to it. So we know very well what the state is also extremely patriarchal. Your family planning programs, though the state wants women to have children, then smaller nations like Malaysia, for example, at one point of time, or after the war, in fact, or during the war, the Second World War, we had nations which actually told women that, or the smaller countries which actually said that our population has to increase, and therefore they gave these kind of soaps for women to have more children. In countries like India and China, it was the reverse. We wanted to limit population control, and we know about a family planning program that we launched way back, which was actually seen as very liberatory because it gave women the right to abort. But obviously the idea was not to give women greater rights. The idea was, of course, to limit the population of the country. Look at religion and how patriarchal it is. Look at all the heads. They're all men, the founders, the gurus, how homophobic. We saw it during the long court battle to read down Section 377. We saw how homophobia, it all came out, from across all religions. You look at any religion, including Buddhism, which is supposed to be quite emancipatory. Actually, there you have Buddhist sanghas which talk about how women are weak, inferior, cannot distinguish between truth and falsity. You have Hinduism, Manu, the author of Dharma Shastra, who said when God created women, he actually allotted them to these qualities of lying, having a wavering mind, and being poisonous and treacherous, and therefore men have to be very careful of women. They are 9 times more sexually powerful than men, and men better be aware of women. Islam also talks about it. Christianity, in fact, speaks about how God created men first, and then from the rib came the woman. So the man is more important than the woman, so on and so forth. We see it in politics as well. Education, subjects, disciplines, professions, pedagogy, everything is so gendered, so people taking science are kind of looked up at, and if you're doing arts, you've scored 98% and you've gone to Xavier's College in Mumbai for arts, people say, what's wrong with you, 98% and you are in arts. So you see how the gendering happens. The gendering is all along. Science especially has been highly, highly patriarchal. When I say gendered, I'm also talking about patriarchy. Science has been very, very patriarchal. And of course, if people say, but we have so many science teachers, and that's really paradoxical. You will have more women as science teachers, as pedagogues, but where are women in research? Where are women? We hardly have women geniuses. All women geniuses happen to be men. In fact, in the 17th, 18th century, there were these interesting debates happening about who is a genius. And they said, genius have got particular kind of hair, and women cannot be a genius because they don't have genius hair. And I wish I could show you that slide. I don't have it here, but there's an interesting photograph which comes from then, which actually tells you about who is a genius and who is not, and why women can't be genius, right? So we see it in every institution. But I thought, let me focus particularly on media, because you're all media practitioners. So in fact, let me cite the insights from a study that we did with Population First, in fact, a collaborative research venture. And this was initiated by Population First on media, on gender sensitivity and inclusivity within media houses. And we covered about 36 media organizations, and we in Mumbai covered 87 respondents. And there were interesting kind of insights which came. This was done recently, 3 years ago. And, so sometimes I wonder that what has really changed over the years, and if at all, has anything changed at all? Or are we getting into newer forms, newer ways in which patriarchy is manifesting itself? So, when we did that study, interestingly, some of the respondents told us, but, why are you looking at a gender lens? How does gender matter in your media organization? It's all about professionalism, I mean, they would actually want us to believe that gender is irrelevant. It really doesn't matter, right? Because apparently it's all about performance. And then and when you dig deeper, you probe deeper, you realize there's misogyny, and there's genderism, there is sexism, there is patriarchy, all of this into media organizations. So we saw that beats were highly gendered, culture and fashion and education was something that was assigned to women. Crime and war reporting, we see that now in Ukraine, isn't it? We see that. I was just thinking about this, the number of the reporters from your broadcast, from NDTV, from India Today, who all are present in Ukraine now, and who goes, women, men, you can see it for yourself and you can watch it for yourself. So, and of course, this is, they say, done for reasons of safety. So even when women want to go, and of course you have Barkhada, but that's an exception, and exceptions don't become they are exceptions and they don't become the rule. So, what we saw is there is glass ceiling at the top level. Technical personnel, very few women. There is a boys club, which is all men stay back after office hours, and all kinds of things happen in terms of networking, connecting to the right kind of people that women miss out on because they say we have to go back to our families. And it was an unwritten code and rule that, and nothing obvious. Obviously, this was something which happened in covert ways. Pregnancy and childbirth were obviously barriers to career growth, all unsaid, of course. Sexual harassment was deep-rooted, and it was something that was not spoken about. In fact, very few spoke about it, and others did speak about it, but they said you are conscious of it, but you don't want redressal, because redressal would mean consequences, and they didn't want that to happen. And then this was, if I may just pause here, Dr. Sharda, how much time do I have? Am I kind of overstepping?
Maybe 5 minutes more, because it's already 2:50.
Yeah. Okay, all right. Okay, I'll just kind of wind up in 5 minutes. So, this was a very interesting study that I thought I will share with you. This is the Pew Research study. This was done just before the pandemic, and the results are out now. It's in the public domain. This is, interestingly, the study tells you that, see how patriarchy seeps in. The study tells you that 55% said both men and women make equally good political leaders. However, they were very clear that in the domestic sphere, men must have more importance than women. And imagine, this is very recent, about 9 in 10 Indians agree that a wife must always obey her husband. 43% actually believe that a man should be the breadwinner, and 43% is quite a bit. And they also said in case of paucity of jobs, men should have higher opportunities for employment than women. So, it's very clear about how, see, in this study, one thing that has come out very clearly, how men have been foregrounded, how men have been centered, and it's very important that they should be primary. Okay. Now, just a little bit about how, so when you're talking about patriarchy, and I said it's very difficult, very difficult to be conscious of patriarchy, let alone fight it. And that's also because patriarchy gives you a lot of security, gives you a lot of benefits, without doubt. And these benefits come to both men and women. But of course, there are more benefits for men than there are for women. And therefore, Bell Hooks says, patriarchy is extremely damaging to men. And, it is something that men don't realize, right? So she says we need to not, instead of talking about masculinity, we need to talk about patriarchal masculinity, and we need to talk about psychological patriarchy and how damaging that can be. And, of course, please, this is something that I need to end with. We need to understand that women do not constitute a homogeneous group. Men do not constitute a homogeneous group. Those in gender marginal locations, the queer population, do not constitute a homogeneous group. There is immense diversity among them. There are differences along caste, class, religion, so on and so forth. It's very important. So as media practitioners, one thing that you all need to do is understand this concept of intersecting vulnerabilities, how these different social locations intersect in different ways to produce enabling or disabling experiences for each one of us, either experiences of oppression or experiences of privilege. Just to give you a few examples, for example, rape is not just about sexual pleasure. In case of Dalit women, rape is rape because they want to teach women a lesson. So Bhamri Devi case, I don't have time to talk about this, Hathras case or the Kathua rape case. You see how the intersection played out. Caste, class, and gender. In the Kathua case, the rape of an 8-year-old Muslim girl. And at that time on social media and everywhere, the question that was being asked, rape is rape, it's bad. Why are we talking about caste? Why are we talking about religion? Of course, we need to talk about this because, your experiences, or they are, it's about these intersecting axes of marginalization, the way, an upper middle class woman, upper caste women experiences rape, sexual assault, or any kind of violation will be very different from lower class lesbian, for instance, women, who is also from the religious minority group, or he is from the lower caste. The experiences are bound to be different in numerous ways. Our access to justice, in fact, will also be mediated through our social locations, right? So, instead of making sweeping generalizations of men being the oppressor and women being the oppressed, I think we need to understand the complexities and the nuances and the layered. What is needed is a layered understanding. And finally, and of course, we see this in judiciary, we see this in environment, we see this in war as well. The effect is always, the environmental degradation will mean different things for women and men. It's not the same for both. Okay. And finally, to conclude, I think it is so important for each one of us, and I keep saying it's so important for each one of us to reflect and introspect. When we did our study, what we found out was the media, which holds a mirror to the society, refused to hold a mirror to itself, refused to turn the gaze inwards and look at yourself. I think that is something that we need to do, and of course, be conscious of your privileges. And as I said, internalize misogyny. Finally, I will end with a quote by Bell Hooks, and she says, if we go from door to door telling men that we should end violence because it's not good, they will say, of course, yes, we will be with you. But the moment you tell them to end violence, you need to end hegemony, you need to end patriarchy, you need to end male domination, then there is a reluctance, then there is a hesitation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Leena. That was really very insightful. Thanks a ton. Yeah. Malti, the question answer session, please.
I think she's muted.
I think there are some questions coming through. Purnima, would you like to just unmute yourself and ask your question, please? Purnima, you'll have to unmute yourself.
And switch your
Can you
camera.
help us with this?
Can I answer? I can read it in the chat box. Can I answer to save time?
Yes.
Yeah.
Please go ahead, ma'am.
This is to respond to Purnima's question. Hi, Purnima. About gender fluidity, Purnima, there's a lot, but you have a session coming up later. So probably the resource person can take that up. So I will go to answering your second question. And I'm sorry, I'm just doing this for the sake of efficient time management. So, of course, patriarchy is practiced by women in the house. Absolutely, without doubt. You see, as I said, patriarchy is in each one of us. All of us are patriarchal. We perpetuate sexism. Some of us are conscious of it. Some of us are not conscious of it. Right? And it's when you have patriarchy, when you have sexism coming in the houses, it happens in everyday rituals, right? It happens in food. It happens in the way we treat our domestic staff, domestic help. It happens in the way we organize our behavior, our conduct, our practices in the home. Just see within the home, just do this study and see who is doing what. I think you will find an answer to your question. I often ask my students to do this. Who is doing how much work at home? That itself will give you an answer.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think this is the one question that I saw in the chat box. Okay, there's one more. Sindhu Vasani asked this: how can we be a good ally to Dalit, marginalized, and queer community without taking their space? Oh, yes, this is something that is, I think this is a very, very important question. So, yes, we can be their ally. We can't speak about them. We cannot speak for them, but certainly they have to speak for themselves. How to be a good ally? I think I've often asked my students this: how do I as a teacher be a good ally? I mean, I always mark out my privileges when I enter the classroom. Savarna teacher teaching in a college which is in South Mumbai. Again, that's a privileged location. And what they talk about is, and I've written this also, that we could probably talk about their experiences. We could have these kind, like this is a space. This is a space where actually I am being an ally because I've got an opportunity to speak about it. So I speak about them. And we can also be an ally by passing the mic and not taking the mic for them. I think that's how I would like to put it. Ensuring that they have their space, not intruding into their space. At the same time, having discussion forums, networking, having conversations with them, I think is a very important way to be an ally. And to take it to wherever you think you can, all right, without necessarily intruding into their space. If that clarifies your question. Snehal asked, women as well as men feel there is too much of wokeness by this. By this, I mean, I often heard colleagues telling that people putting cisgender, them, they to their bio is extreme wokeness. What do you think about it? Okay, so with this, there is an additional thing that we were discussing a few days back. Now it's also woke, some people say when people say TW, trigger warning. So, what I have been noticing of late is a kind of, I would not say a refusal to know reality or see reality, but a kind of thing about, oh, we don't want to see this, we don't want to know about it. I think that's problematic, because just because then you are exercising your own privilege, that just because you are not comfortable with it, just because you haven't experienced it, you don't want to see the reality for it. And I think this is a criticism that has come especially from the Dalit community, who talk about what is a harsh everyday reality for them. And when they put it out in the public space, people say you should do it with a trigger warning. I think it's taking this a bit too far. So, but about what you put in terms of making your pronouns very clear and all, I think it's essential. It is important because, as someone said, that it's not just wokeness. Some of them also say oh, how much to learn, how much to be politically correct, how much to do this. But, as someone said, if you could learn all the physics and chemistry theorems all through your life, did all of that, why are you having a difficulty in knowing this? Especially people who are in urban areas. I think it's important. I think it's also important because I gave you the example of my student. My student felt excluded because I was not using the right kind of pronoun. So I think it's important because language, remember, is a very important. Language is not just a means of communication. Remember, language is also about power. So when I do not use the right kind of pronouns in many ways, there are slippages here and there is a danger here. No? I'm actually not being very inclusive. I'm not being very kind. I'm not being very compassionate. So I think it's important.
So we have another question coming in from Swati Thapa. Swati, would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question, please? Otherwise, I'll just read it out. She says, I'm learning more about gender. However, that Leena ma'am opened the dialogue about sex test. There is a debate going on if trans women should be allowed to compete with women, if it is your opinion. I totally comply that trans women are women, but then people open questions about biological difference.
See, I don't generally get into biology at all. It's about, especially after the Nalsara judgment, because if you get into this whole biology debate, I think it's endless. Of course, and in many ways, this, when people talk about biology, I am a little skeptical. I become very, very suspicious because this whole thing is then you are basically trying to use biology or this fact of biological difference to justify the kind of very irrational, illogical arguments that come in, which can be a little problematic. I mean, I think if you use biology all the time to understand, you are denying agency to people. That's how I look at it. And I think it's important when people tell us that what they think about themselves, I think we need to validate it. It is legitimate, right? Rather than getting into questions and debates of, but why? So I would not would ever support this whole idea of biological arguments and stuff like that. And trans women competing with women, I don't see that as, I know there's a debate about it, but if you ask me, I don't see that as competition as such. It's about maybe it's how they feel, is what they want to become. And I think we should just respect that.
So we have two people who've raised their hands.
Ritu, we really do not have time now.
Yeah, I know.
Okay. So can I just quickly take one question from Soumya, where she says, from Purnima, could you share a few tips on how to do sensitive reporting on gender?
Okay, this is very simple. It's a little complex, but just to kind of make it very short is, Purnima, I think we have to be very careful that we are not misgendering people, right? And we have to be, especially as media practitioners, I don't think you can escape the responsibility of not being very sensitive about pronouns, right? And about not misgendering people and not to assume people's gender from their gender expression. Right? When you write, when you report, when you research. And it's very important to ask people about their, and this is about of course, the queer population, but gender, again, you have another session, I think, on gender sensitive reporting, but I can just give you one example. I often read reports on sexual assault and cases of sexual violence, and I'm kind of like, I'm cringing literally because I see a lot of problem in the way they are reported. I mean, I find it a little titillating at times. I mean, this is not to deny that there is also reporting which is very nuanced and which is very, very sensitive, but I also see other kind of write-ups which are hugely problematic in terms of making it a little titillating and a little graphic and explicit. And the other problem is, this whole idea of sensationalizing the incident and not doing a follow-up. Okay, this also, I think, it's about, so what is important is what about the idea of the woman getting justice? That is lost somewhere in this whole business of kind of, in a sense, sensationalizing it, talking about it endlessly, on and on, without, and then missing the larger point. So I think we need to be a little sensitive about, especially how we see, you must understand, especially in cases of sexual assault, to be able to report itself is an act of courage. and then to be able to read. This is one example. Then if I can give you examples of things which have, of course, I don't know whether that's the right example, but the kind of reporting that happened following Sushant Singh Rajput's death by suicide, and about this Riya Chakrabarti and things like that. It was absolutely, it was such a shocker. It really pained us in the way, the gaze was so problematic. The content was so problematic. I wish one could avoid those kind of things. If I've been able to answer, I don't know.
Yep. I think.
Thank you so much, Leena. Let's end the session here because we have the other people waiting, and it was so good. I'm sure there are many more questions, and we can take them up once all the other two sessions are over, if there is time and if you're there with us.
Yeah, maybe I can join later. Thank you so much. Thank you. Lovely interacting with us.
Thank you. Malti, would you please introduce the other panelists?
Thank you, Dr. Leena. So our next panelists are Sameera Khan and Dr. Vibhuti Patel, and they will take us through a session on the nuances of reporting on gender-based violence. Professor Dr. Vibhuti Patel is a well-known professor at Advanced Center for Women Studies, School of Development Studies, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, as well as S&T Women's University, Mumbai. She is currently on several expert committees and working groups and has authored numerous books on various aspects of gender. Professor Vibhuti Patel would be sharing with us some data on gender-based violence and the social cultural factors and underpinning gender-based violence. Thank you, Professor Vibhuti Patel. Over to you, please.
Yeah. So good afternoon, friends. And first of all, I would like to congratulate Dr. Sharda Malti for instituting this fellowship, and very good. And Laadli has changed the mindset of media personnel and media practitioners for over last 20 years. And the kind of work which has done has completely changed the media reporting on gender issues. And today is I retired from TISS 2 years back. So now I'm freelance, and I would like to share my PPT as I have to show the data. I'm not allowed screen sharing. Please allow me to share the screen.
Yes, ma'am, you can do it now.
Yeah. So is it visible?
Yeah, it's coming.
Yeah. So I think recently the question of gender-based violence has been globally discussed, mainly because of the UN Women's Advisory in March, immediately after the pandemic triggered lockdown, that all over the world, in all 204 countries, gender-based violence has escalated between 3 times to 10 times. And the most shocking news was in Mexico City. In one day, 80 women were murdered by their intimate partners. Now, why did it happen? Gender-based violence was there even in the pre-COVID period. But what we saw was that social isolation and also women being forced to stay in the proximity of the tormentor. Because in normal circumstances, whenever the violence takes place, you run away, you try to seek help, police intervenes. But because all resources were directed to corona management and COVID management, the timely help or timely support did not arrive. And that's why we saw all these posters, which are also the product of last 2 years, that what kind of isolation women. India is committed to Sustainable Development Goal. Goal number 5 is totally dedicated to empowerment of women. But what we see, the exact scenario, when it comes to any kind of social change which women try individually or as a group, they face violence. So currently 1 in 3 women have experienced some form of physical or sexual violence in their lifetime in India. So this is the data, and all other demographic data also shows, as Dr. Leena Pujari also told us, that how we see subordination of women in all aspects of life, whether it is a workforce or in the family or in the community or in decision making, we see that overall subordination of women also manifests in various forms of violence that women have faced. Now, if we see the data from the National Crime Records Bureau, we see that the nature and the variety of crimes which are taking place, gender-based violence, they have gone up from 2005 to 2020. 2019-20, during the lockdown, certain types of crimes like street harassment or abduction of women and girls, all those type of crimes have reduced. But at the same time, domestic violence escalated. NFHS 5 also showed that domestic violence is still a very, very important concern for Indian women. Now, so if we see as Leena also said, that how the kind of responses which NFHS got when it came to attitude of the youth or attitude of the community regarding women's domestic violence or violence against women. There was many who agreed, like 42% of respondents in NFHS survey said that the violence is justified if a woman disobeys man in the family, or if 42% say that if she spends money without asking the elders like in-laws and husband, then violence is justified. No, or if she fails to care, more than 50% of the respondents said that violence is justified if woman fails to care for children. Or 60%, nearly 61% said that if a woman leaves the dependent or an adult unattended, like whatever demands they make, and if she's not able to, if she doesn't fulfill those demands immediately, then violence against her is justified. If woman doesn't cook or she fails to prepare meal, nearly 2/3 of the respondents said that violence is justified. If she fails to fetch water or a firewood, there too we say 65% say that violence is justified. If a woman leaves the house without permission, then nearly 87%, like 86% of the respondents said that violence is justified. So you can imagine the internalization of these values that women can be, and that is there right from the ancestral time when Tulsidas ji said that drum, broom, Shudra and women, they should be periodically beaten up. The Dol, Gamar, Shuddha, Pashunari, ye sab tadan ke adhikari. So this is the reality that we are facing even in 21st century in 2022. United Nations declared violence against women as a shadow pandemic. So we have a pandemic of coronavirus, but there are a variety of shadow pandemics that we witnessed during this last 2 years. And WHO also had to issue an advisory where it says that violence impacts women's health and it is a public health issue. You can't treat violence against women as a personal problem of a woman, but whether it is injuries as a result of violence, depression or anxiety disorder, mental health has emerged as a very important concern in the during the COVID period or even in the post-COVID period. Sexually transmitted infections which take place as a result of violence or as a result of rape, whether within the marriage or in the society where the rape takes place. After every war, incidences of HIV/AIDS increased in Africa. So the defeated community, the defeated nation, where the soldiers of the winning nation, they indulge into mass rape. No? So currently at 200 places on this planet, wars are going on. So you can imagine what must be happening to women and children in those areas. Self-harm or suicide, that also results because of violence. Unwanted pregnancies, we saw that during this last 24 months, unwanted pregnancies became a major issue, and so many harmful methods of pregnancy, abortion were used by the in-laws, by the husband, by the community, because there were no contraceptives available during the pandemic. And because 24/7 men were there in the house. Today also we have got the news of a man, 45-year-old man who raped his 7-year and 11-year-old daughter, and only when the second youngest daughter was raped by him, the elder one mustered up courage to file FIR. Even Kerala case is being debated nationally recently, where now after the daughter has become pregnant, 11-year-old daughter has become pregnant, the father is he's repenting. The study done by Jamia Millia Institute, University Women's Studies Center has also shown that during last 2 years, the sexual violence that took place, 51% of the cases of survivor of sexual violence were such where intimate family members, they were raped by intimate family members, including father, brother, cousin, uncle, and distant relatives. No, so it is such a rampant issue, and the question of control over sexuality, fertility, and labor of women and girls, I think that is the one thing which women's movement has continuously challenged, whether it was in 19th century social reform movement, where Tarabai Modak, in her book Stri Purush Tulna, which she wrote as a result of a pregnant widow who was ostracized by the community, and you know the condition of widows at that time was so deplorable, and they had no agency. And even when they became pregnant, it was not because of their love affair, but it was the way they were raped by the family members. We have seen in the freedom movement also that so many women who joined the freedom movement, they also discuss the case of discrimination in the family and various forms of violence. In fact, it was Pushpa Ben Mehta who prevailed upon the British regime to institute a committee to examine suicides in India, that why so many young women were committing suicide. And that report is very, very eye-opening. Whatever is happening now, it was happening even in the 19th century. And that's why she started a movement of shelter homes, which are called Vikas Guru. So making developmental investment on these women so that they don't have to end their life after being sexually violated. We saw that after 75, the new women's rights movement also raised this issue. It was a young tribal woman who was raped in the police station. In response to that, the nationwide anti-rape movement came into existence. Women from all parts of India, they traveled to Delhi. Our Parliament of India was encircled by women's chain in 1980 with a central demand of reopening of Mathura case, where the judgment given by Justice Chandrachud was full of misogyny and full of classist bias. As Leena said about intersectionality, there was no empathy about the intersectional marginality which this young tribal girl was facing. And after that, we saw only two amendments we managed to get, that before the sunset and before sunrise and after sunset, women should not be called to police station all by herself, and she should be accompanied by her relatives. And in case of custodial rape, the burden of proof was on the accused, not in other cases. But it was only in 2012, when Nirbhaya tragedy, where a young woman was raped in a moving bus, and the spontaneous resistance and the protests that we witnessed throughout India in the whole month of December, that we saw Parliament of India, they decided to appoint committee, the Justice Verma committee. More than 18,000 suggestions were given by the citizens of India, and the manifesto of women's charter for women's freedom was created by Justice Verma and Attorney General Seth. But two issues were still not accepted by Indian Parliament. One was a marital rape, and other one with the argument that if we criminalize rape by a husband, then it would shake the institution of family. And also, if army man is accused of rape, then also they would not be court-martialed or punished, because they are immune, because otherwise it will demoralize the Indian Defence Force. So on these two counts, Indian women's movement is still building up pressure that we must criminalize marital rape and also rape by the defense forces. We have also seen that it was in the global initiative which the women's movement took, and in 1993 UNHRC organized international conference in which the slogan "Women's rights are human rights" was accepted. Before that, all international human rights organizations were not accepting violation against women or sexual violence as a human rights issue. They were treating it as a personal problem or a problem of a community or an isolated incident, but now it has been accepted as an important social and political issue. And we have seen that 15 days of activism on violence against women from 25th November to 10th December. I think each year that we are commemorating is mainly because of this effort. In the Millennium Development Goal, goal number 3 was empowerment of women, which only focused on health, education, political participation, decision making, and employment. Violence was not included. And the women's movement throughout the world, it also lobbied, and by mid-decade, when the review meeting took place, violence was included in the Millennium Development Goals, combating violence against women. And in the Sustainable Development Goal, where we have 17 goals and 614 targets, everywhere the gender issues are mainstream, whether you are discussing poverty, hunger, education, developmental concern, everywhere you have to deal with the question of violence against women. And the goal number 5, SDG 5, is totally dedicated to empowerment of women. When we try to understand violence against women, we have to understand the whole journey of an individual woman or women or anyone who is at the receiving end, who is perceived as a powerless. So there is a situation, the overall situation of inequality, intersectional inequality that we are experiencing. So some section of people who enjoy the rights, others are left out. For how do we respond to this kind of inequality? By promise of equality in the constitution, but still your social location of caste or class or religion or race or gender is such that even when there is a nominal equality on constitution, in reality you don't get. So what we have is an affirmative action, and this affirmative action is equity. So you create a level playing field, you create an ecosystem, you create an environment where equality becomes possible. That means you give them progressive legislations, you provide the quota, you provide security by the state, because every crime against women in our country is a crime against the state. It is not only the crime of that woman. So even if you can't fight your battle, state is there to fight your battle, no? So even Nirbhaya's case, it was the Indian government that took the responsibility of ensuring justice to her. And even after equity that you have for your developmental needs, you need justice, because so many prejudices based on patriarchy, based on caste, based on racism, based on any sectarian values are there. And those who are erring, those who violate the human rights of fellow human being, they should be brought to justice. So when we talk about women's rights or human rights, we need to understand that this is the long journey that one has to go through. What we have seen when it comes to domestic violence, women's movement managed to get 498A way back in the 80s, but it was a very limited. The response of 498A, which demands investigation by a higher official when any woman dies under suspicious circumstances or faces any form of psychological or physical violence, then it becomes a cognizable offense demanding arrest. But what was the demand of the women's movement? That when it comes to women's existence, you can't divide criminal from civil. Whether you are talking about the marriage, divorce, custody of child, right to stay in a parental home, right to stay in a matrimonial home, your inheritance rights, any time a woman talks of her right, she faces violence. Violence from parents, violence from brother, violence from in-laws, violence from husband. So we need a law that takes care of both the civil matters and criminal matters. We have seen in family court, in front of our eyes, a woman gets a divorce. Okay, and in the court, in front of the judge, ex-husband has a guts to beat her up black and blue. Okay, and then the judge would say, oh, now you are divorced. This is a criminal matter. Now you file another case in the criminal court. So we did not, and woman would spend all her life just fighting the legal cases. So the demand for a comprehensive law, which is Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act 2005, after 30 years of consistent struggle, documentation, research, and also the participatory action research, which was done by a team called the LASA, where 1,200 bedded hospitals called Baba Hospital, in which they started providing support to women survivor of violence in every way. 5 service providers: legal machinery, criminal justice system, police, counselors, medical attention, and the shelter. All 5 of them were provided at one particular point, that is called casualty ward of the hospital. So in Maharashtra, we have a one-stop crisis center in the hospital, while in Andhra Pradesh, they have a community-based one-stop crisis center. We learned about one-stop crisis center from other Asian countries such as Malaysia, Hong Kong, Singapore, Philippines. So our team of doctors visited those countries and they said how it works so well, so that a survivor of violence doesn't have to run from pillar to post, from police station to court to hospital to shelter home, that she doesn't have to do. All the services get converged into one point. So this law, the new law, which talks about recognizes the right to residence, women can't be thrown out, provision of the appointment of protection officers and recognition of service providers. It also provides the training for the protection officers and judges, because we have seen so many judgments which are totally insensitive and misogynist. Even the judges themselves also in so many places are accused of not paying maintenance or violating the Domestic Violence Act in their personal life. So it is very important. Gender sensitization is very important. So awareness generation about the law and the 5 service providers for which each and every state need to allocate budget. So the central government gives a certain percentage of budget for implementation of Domestic Violence Act, and also the state government has to give the matching grant. We have also seen the other important issues regarding the violence against women. One is the child sexual abuse. It was as a result of the collective efforts of child rights organizations who were working with the street children. They are the ones who insisted on a new law called Protection of Children from Sexual Abuse Ordinance, which is called POCSO Act. POCSO Act also, there have been, like, it was basically the community-based organizations. They invited the attention of rampant child sexual abuse happening in our country, in the community, in the society, the incestuous relations existing in the extended family and the nuclear family, and also in the schools and by traveling from home to wherever, school or wherever children went. So child sexual abuse, now there is an acknowledgement after 2012, there is an acknowledgement that it is a very important concern. National Commission for Women reported that on Childline 1098 helpline, in just 1 year, 375,000 children made distress call. And all this distress call, among them, 25% calls were by the adolescent girls in the age group of 14 to 18. So you can understand the enormity of problem that even these children managed to use the helpline. There are so many who could not. Behind every one such case of getting access to helpline, there were 10 who would not have got the access. Amendments in the rape laws that we got in 2013 after Nirbhaya tragedy was the very comprehensive definition of rape. Even the cyber crime, cyber stalking is also now included in the sexual violence, and burden of proof is on the accused, not on the survivor. And also the prevention, we got third very important law regarding sexual violence is the sexual harassment at workplace, 2013. According to World Bank, sexual harassment is the most devastating occupational hazard of the 21st century. Women are entering all walks of life earlier, which were completely controlled and monopolized by men. Women are engineers, they are scientists, they are doctors, they are traveling. Their mobility has also increased. So the backlash of violence has also increased, and institutional mechanism to address the instances of sexual harassment, about that also gender sensitization is important, is mandatory for the employer. So every enterprise and employer or corporate sector, they have to do mandatory training about the law, and not knowing the law cannot be the alibi if the incident of sexual harassment takes place in your office. India adopted Women Empowerment Policy 2001, which talks about the welfare, access, conscientization, and participation in decision making. This policy also addresses the question of gender-based violence and sexual violence very seriously. Women's movement has always looked at sex-selective abortion of pre-birth sex-selective abortion of girl or a female fetus as a manifestation of violence against women, because women and girls throughout their life cycle face varied forms of violence. So this campaign against sex selective abortions and judicious implementation of preconception and prenatal diagnostic techniques at 2002 is also very important demand. Unfortunately, during last 24 months, the PCPNDT Act was freezed. So many sex selective abortions have taken place. We don't even have data about that, but UNFPA has predicted that the sex ratio has really drastically become adverse. Coming to the question of LGBTQIA movement and the violence faced by them, various forms of psychological, emotional, sexual, physical violence and exclusion, discrimination, and ostracization that the community faces. After so many, nearly 3 decades of consistent lobbying and campaigning, what we got in 2019 was Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act, with full of limitation. Dr. Leena Pujari has told us exhaustively about who determines your gender, and NALSA judgment also she has talked about. So this act, which leaves the discretion, which leaves assigning of the gender to the magistrate, district magistrate or a doctor, is totally unacceptable, and it's a violation of right to life, right to privacy, and the transgender community has totally opposed this. Another very objectionable thing is that there is a lesser punishment for rape of a transgender person, which is just 2 years. Now, we know that transgender persons lead such an insecure life. Their own biological parents disown them. So many of them have to survive on the streets, survive through begging. They have to survive by sex work, and they face tremendous sexual violence. And still, the state has not shown any sensitivity to this kind of a human tragedy. And in normal cases of sexual violence or rape or a gang rape or a POCSO cases, you have a 7 to 10 years of rigorous punishment. While when it comes to transgender persons' violation of bodily integrity and dignity, the punishment is only 2 years, which is a utter injustice. The act doesn't talk about any developmental investment for transgender persons, no reservation in job, no scholarships for education, nothing about their shelter. The homelessness is the most pronounced reality of transgender person, but the act is not talking about that. Unless you make developmental investment, you can't make the lives of transgender persons violence free. That's very important. What Ratmabai asked in 1884 about the child marriage, and when she was forced into child marriage, I think that is true even now. Currently, we have seen that during the pandemic, so many social reforms that we had in the 19th century and at the time of freedom movement, all of them are completely wiped out because of the pandemic. Recurrence, increased incidences of child marriages, trafficking of children, forced child labor, forced female infanticide, and various forms of violence against children, women, and minorities. I think that has also raised a serious question. Are we going to turn the wheels of history in a backward direction? And if we don't, then I think all of you, me, women's movement, the media, the people's representatives, community organizations, all of us will have to be very serious in reporting the crimes of this nature, sexual violence, and also increase the legal awareness about these issues, whether it is a question of dowry Prohibition Act, Indecent Representation of Women's Act, cyber pornography, or cyber stalking, Prevention of Immoral Traffic Act or Trafficking Act, Sati Prevention Act, POCSO Act, Sexual Harassment, Prevention of Sexual Harassment Act, PCPNDT Act, Prevention of Witch Hunting Act. We have seen that over the last 2 years, so many cases of witch hunting are reported in 14 states of our country. So many communities treat corona as a corona mai. There was a time when we used to call Shitla Mata. There was, if the mother is angry, she gives you smallpox. The same way, women are being alleged for corona virus in their family. If anybody is suffering from COVID, then it is women of the household who would be alleged. And there have been so many COVID widows and COVID orphans, and they are alleged that they have eaten up or they have destroyed their husband. No, and a lot of witch hunting is happening. Only 2 states have come up with the law criminalizing witch hunting, which is only Orissa and Rajasthan. There are many other states which have submitted the bill in the Legislative Assembly, but still the laws are not there. One last one is a very important: honor killing, crimes in the name of honor. First of all, there is no honor in killing because it is a custodial killing. It is their own people from the community, caste panchayat. They are killing young couples who are choosing their life partner. So it's a choice-based marriage ending in an extremely brutal murder. Me Too movement has also been very pronounced in last 5 years. Even during the pandemic, we have seen so many women, garment workers, young women employees, or women, even teachers, women in academia, women in art and art world, women in the film industry. They have used social media to highlight the question of sexual harassment in their profession. And it is very important to understand that it takes a lot of courage to speak, because the backlash that you have to face once you come out and when you stick out your neck is so high. So you need to have a we have seen even in the film industry in Kerala or even in Andhra Pradesh, women have come together. The main empowering lesson of this Me Too movement is that woman is not isolated. When one journalist says she was sexually violated, there are many others who have similar experiences. They also stick out their neck. So there is a strength in unity, and that's why Me Too movement, we should look at Me Too movement with a lot of empathy, and we must understand that Me Too is not women against man. Me Too is all of us against toxic patriarchy. Toxic patriarchy, which thinks that they have entitlement over fellow human beings' bodies. When we borrow even a pen, we take a permission of a person whose pen we take. But when it comes to women's body, this patriarchs, they think that they have entitlement, and it is also manifestation of their power, that they are access, as Dr. Leena Pujari also told us. So what we have seen, that as this bar chart from National Commission for Women shows, that during the pandemic, the blue bar, as you can see, the varied forms of violence against women, whether it's a domestic violence, harassment of a married women, police, rape and attempt to rape, right to live with dignity, sexual assault, sexual harassment, all of them increased just in 9 months. I'm talking from March 19 to December 2020. After that, we have not received the data. So, and the boys' locker room phenomena, which happened in an elite school in Delhi, where boys were conspiring to rape their classmates. And one boy blurted it out to his journalist mother, who reported, who just filed FIR against this. And so a big scandal came out. So a lot of online violence, online trolling, online stalking, and online sexual pornographic this thing have been exchanged. And I think we need to take that also very seriously and generate awareness. Now, several state governments have come out with their responses during the lockdown, like I Want to Speak, Mala Bolaiche Ahe. This is the portal created by police, Maharashtra Police, or several NGOs. They also have time and again publicize their mobile numbers, which are operating 24/7. Several helplines for domestic violence, for police help, for security at railway, child helpline, NHRC helplines, and National Commission and State Commission helplines are in public domain, and they are taking immediate action. We also need to explain that how to access the law, which is also very important, as this flow chart shows, that if you want to file a complaint under Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act, what kind of steps you need to take. So I think right from filing FIR till your judgment comes, what kind of homework that a survivor of violence or a petitioner has to do is very important. Women's movement has also come up with a poster with which are and all these women's groups, they network with each other. So whichever part of India you are in and you face any violence, if you contact any one of them, they put you in touch with the other helplines. Educational institutions like Tata Institute of Social Sciences or several universities, NSS department, they have started the helpline. And currently, even for the mental well-being and mental health challenges that people are facing due to multifaceted emergencies they had to face under the pandemic, they are also operating. The kind of response sometimes you get when you access the helpline, sometimes you get a very apathetic or a negative response, but that should not deter you. There are many other ways also in which the support was given when your tormentor is in your proximity. So even when you make a blank call, the helpline would know that there is something serious, and they would respond. We need to understand this pyramid very clearly, and this pyramid was prepared by the women's movement after the boys' locker room phenomena, that we have been receiving so many jokes, rape jokes, or the kind of statement that boys will be boys, women are the prey and man are hunter. You have to be guarded, always beti bachao, but nobody would talk, protect the girl, protect women. That is the kind of stance state has taken. But what have you educated your boy to be gender sensitive, to be respectful, to have you explained to him what is consent and what is force? Okay. So this sexist, homophobic, transphobic jokes and objectification, if we don't protest against it, we take it lightly, then we are rigidifying the gender stereotypes. We are rigidifying the glass ceiling at workplaces, because you will always keep women under the state of subjugation, subordination, terrorization, and the silence them, won't give them mic. Okay, so gender stereotypes will keep the women at the lowest bottom of the pyramid. So what we need to protest against this kind of gender stereotypes also. Third stage, if we don't do anything, then the third stage would be stalking, eve teasing, which is a highly objectionable term. Why should we use it? It is a sexual harassment, street harassment, you can say, revenge pornography, or rape threats or harassment. And if you don't take stand even against that, that's what we have has happened. The Zoom bombing that has taken place in the classrooms of schools and colleges or in the webinars. If you don't file the complaint now to the cyber cell, these people will become bolder, and they think that, there is no impunity. And then actual rape, sexual coercion, and physical abuse happen. And even, and the ultimate would be the murder. And that's what we have seen. So many teenage girls who have been raped or gang raped, they have been murdered to kill to destroy the evidences. So I think we need to, the sexual violence that exists in a pyramid, and action at the bottom is very, very important. If you don't take any action to challenge that, then you are reinforcing the upper layers. So that is very, very important message that we all need to keep into consideration. So risk songs or lewd remarks or even flashes during the online classes, teachers are saying we are helpless. We know that it is very damaging, but we are helpless. But this attitude will not do. We will have to take action. We will have to make our students and teachers and the community and the masses aware about the laws of the land, which are there to curb or to prevent this kind of criminal behavior and this kind of sexual violence. And this particular note written by a gentleman during the pandemic is very, very important. And it goes like this, and I quote, "We talked about how many women were raped last year, not about how many men raped women. We talked about how many girls in the school district were harassed last year, not about how many boys harassed girls. We talked about how many teenage girls got pregnant in the state of Vermont last year, rather than how many men and teenage boys got the girls pregnant." So you can see how the use of this passive voice has a political effect. I think Dr. Leena Pujari told us very, very, with very, very effective examples that language is so important. It shifts the focus of men and boys and onto girls and women. Even the term violence against women is problematic. It is a passive construction. There is no active agent in the sentence. It is a bad thing that happens to women. It is a bad thing that happens to women. But when you look at the term, that term, violence against women, nobody is doing it to them. It just happens. Men aren't even part of it. No, so here lies the problem, that we don't make men responsible for this kind of act and their responsibility to prevent violence against women. And that's what we all experience. Even at the time of reverse migration, the whole migration discourse was focusing on male migrant. It was the photographs taken by the civilians who explained, and now these women are giving their testimony of what all happened to them when they migrated.
Sorry, Vibhuti, but we have to close it because we are overshooting the time.
Yeah. Okay. So during the pandemic, I think the incidences of violence, they enhanced much more. And these 6 studies which are done during the pandemic by Akshara, then One Future Collective, Sahaj and Sehat, and the 20 NGOs which were providing support to the survivor of violence, they are extremely important. I request all of you to go through them. I have also shared the links of all these articles. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Vibhuti Patel. Thank you so much. It's an interesting subject on gender-based violence. Thank you so much.
I must say it was so very elaborate and it was so very insightful. Thanks a ton, Vibhuti. Thanks a lot.
Okay, can I take? Now we have with us Sameera Khan, who would be sharing some do's and don'ts in reporting on rape. Sameera Khan is a Mumbai-based independent journalist, researcher, and co-author of the critically acclaimed book, Why Loiter? Women and Risk on Mumbai Streets, which examine women's access to public space. A former assistant editor of the Times of India for the past decade, she has guided journalists on covering violence against women, particularly rape. Over to you, Sameera ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, can you view my slide? Yeah. I'm going to try to race because I'm anyway following 2 very fine speakers, Dr. Pujari and Dr. Vibhuti Patel, who have laid out the scene so well about gender-based violence and so many details with legal and historical details about that. I'm going to focus really on how to report on rape, and I'm sort of happy to give you inputs on that. So it is a distressing subject. So if someone is really uncomfortable, you can mute me. But if you're a potential journalist, I'm sorry, but you probably will have to bear with me in that sense. First of all, just to give you an overall context, basically many surveys have shown that women are rarely the central focus of news stories in the Indian media. This is particularly true of stories related to politics or related to the media, or related to the economy, politics or the economy. But the Global Media Monitoring Project, which every 5 years monitors how the media covers gender, as well as what is the situation with gender within newsrooms, its 2015 report revealed that in one category, women were overwhelmingly represented in the Indian media. That is 40% of the news subjects in stories about violent crimes were women, which means women are disproportionately represented in news stories. They're less represented in stories on environment or health or education or politics and economy, certainly, but much more represented in sort of crime stories, in violent crime stories. In the last decade, since the 2012 Nirbhaya gang rape case, news reportage of rape and violence against women has gone up in terms of quantity across all media languages as well. Has this also qualitatively improved rape coverage, or has rape coverage become more gender sensitive? It's a mixed picture, yes and no. And it's obviously clearly shown that it needs constant attention, supervision, and awareness on the part of media organizations and journalists. It's something which you can slip off very easily if you don't pay attention to it. So Dr. Sharda asked me to focus on the common mistakes we make when reporting on gender-based violence, particularly rape, the new laws and guidelines and the implications, and do's and don'ts. So I have sort of woven them all together in this presentation. I hope not to make it very long, unless we have a discussion. So let's start with who is the media most often reporting on when it covers rape. Okay, so very often when the media is reporting, it's people like us versus people like them. there's an overemphasis on the coverage of rape in urban areas, particularly of middle class, upper class women and girls, and those that belong to higher castes. These get reported more often and in greater detail than rapes involving poor women, rural women, Adivasi women, and lower caste women. So while rape of a middle class woman in cities like Bombay and Delhi, such as, let's say, the Uber rape cab case in December 2014, or the Shakti Mills case, which involved a photojournalist, these get reported much more in depth, and it stays on the pages for many more longer. The rape of working class women, such as a domestic worker, seldom receives the same level of attention, or if it does also get attention, the tone is quite different. So, for example, just to show you, I mean, this class and caste bias on who we cover and who we don't enough. So people like us, other people who sort of who are more middle class, more urban, metropolitan cities, those crimes get more coverage. But people like them, so whether we have the Bhutmange, mother and daughter in Khairlanji, we have in Dantewad, in Chhattisgarh, all these murders happening. The Jisha case in Kerala, which got coverage in Kerala quite a bit, but not really elsewhere. The Manorama case in Manipur in 2004, where it really gets national coverage only when the Mira Paibis, the mother groups, some of the older women strip themselves and stand in front of Assam rifles accused of the rape and murder and say, Indian army come rape us. So when they set themselves up for a dramatic picture, it's really setting themselves up not only to get attention from the army and bringing attention to AFSPA being in the state, but also attention to the national media to pay attention. So it's really important that the media pay attention to this aspect. Similarly, if you have working women, if they're sort of bankers or work in bigger cities, or like, for example, this Pratibha Murthy case, which took place in 2005 in Bangalore, which involved BPO workers. When the early 2000s, there was a big slew of 4 or 5 years, a lot of coverage of how many huge amounts of women working in the BPO industry, and they're doing the back end work for the world. And basically, they were transported at night in vehicles provided by the offices and transported back in the morning. And there were a lot of assaults on them. Pratibha Murthy was a famous one in Bangalore. And it gets nationwide attention. All the news stories, all the news weeklies that we had at the cover story, and more importantly, industry sitting away. So NASCOM and tech industries paying attention to this, saying, no, we want our tech workers safe. We want these back, and so we assure it. We will change. So they changed rules. Many companies changed rules. The industry sat and rethought it and had meetings about it. So when women are at risk in a certain category, they get a lot of attention from the industry, but also from the media. But if you have a working class woman who's also a working woman, when an assault happens to her, the attention is very different, the tone. So, for example, this case, this story ran in the National Daily just about 10 days after Shiny Ahuja, the actor, was accused of raping his maid. And this is like a frothy, light story on a subject which is very serious, but talking about the maid trap, as the maids trap employers. And it uses language like, for a repressed Indian male, a maid can be an inviting prospect, a subject of domination, an outlet of their desires. Also it's basically sexualizes the maid thing, and the whole thing is a passion play. I mean, attraction towards a maid of a male employer, rather than looking at it that this is assault, it's a crime. It's it's sort of dismissed off in those terms within a week or when the Shining Ahuja case happened. And this is a very common occurrence, So working class women and assaults on them are not taken so seriously, and they even invite weekend reading like this. Similarly, there's also visible class and caste bias in reporting of perpetrators. So when the alleged perpetrators are men from the lower classes or lower caste, working class men accused, particularly of assaulting middle class women, the tone is very different. It's very strident. It's very dunning for them. It's asking for the death penalty for rape. But when it's men from upper classes and castes, the tone is less outraged in that sense. So, for example, this was about rape took place in 2000. A gang rape took place in 2009 in Bombay of a university student, and this was the story, and by some group of South Bombay elite college boys from South Bombay colleges. And this is the lead. The lead says one was a guitarist, another played basketball, some were soft-spoken, others had great communication skills. One was a biotechnology major. Many were involved in extracurricular activities. Some had innocent faces. I don't know what that means, but anyway, nearly all of them were from coveted Mumbai colleges. None quite fit the profile of a rapist. Now, this is one of the most ridiculous first paragraphs describing perpetrators of a gang rape. But because they happen to be middle class, upper class boys from the South Bombay colleges, this is the paragraph they get. Immediately put a working class man there who's been accused of a similar crime and a group of working class men, they will definitely not get a paragraph like this in the leading daily of the city. So clearly there is a huge, these are very important questions that the media has to confront about whose rape it covers and whose it doesn't and what tone it uses. So do consider whether your story is tainted by a class or caste bias or only being reported in a certain tone because it involves people of a certain class or caste or a community background. So keep paying, very important to pay attention to intersectional elements in your story, whether look at whether it's poor women, working class women, lower caste women, minority women, marginalized women, women with disabilities, etc. These women are actually more vulnerable to violence. Some of their categories make them more vulnerable. So note the structures of power such as caste, which enable more brutal violence in that sense. So media has to be really mindful of these categories. And I know previous speakers have talked about intersectionality coming in. Then there's the question of, that was the who the media most often reports on when it reports rape. The other is, what is the media most often reporting on when it covers rape? And the media's growing fascination with sexual violence also focuses disproportionately on violence against women in public. Okay, particularly, and that violence is also covered very differently from violence faced by men. As men are an accepted presence in public space, violence against them is represented generically, but assaults on women always put the spotlight on their sexual safety. Most importantly, no reporter ever suggests of a male survivor, but what he's doing there. So my favorite example is that 2 a.m. at night, a man and a woman are involved in an accident. The man will be asked, was it a drunk driver who had an accident against you, and that's why you collapsed, that's why you're in hospital, how sad, how terrible, what did you drink and drive? But if a woman has an accident, I'm not even talking about sexual assault, at 2 a.m. at night, they will say, but what were you doing? They won't say whether it was a drunk driver involved or who was involved, whatever. But the first thing is, what were you doing there? Were you alone? What were you wearing? That is asked, but men are never asked these questions. The men's presence in public is accepted. So by continuously casting public space as more dangerous, the problem is of that, things like this, headlines will be about constantly telling us about this danger which lies in public space for women. And that's why every time an assault takes place, no wonder it's always followed by day 2 coverage of what they should have done right, what were they wearing, who were they with, why were they out. Constantly that is asked of them, never asked of. So this is one thing, this casting public space is dangerous. But the more really important thing is, by casting public space and stranger violence against women, as there's a more dangerous category, you actually avoid talking about the seriousness of domestic violence, okay, which by all statistic indicators in India is the bigger villain. Or if you follow the NCRB statistics, so you see that domestic violence is much more of a problem for women. So public violence is also a reality, but so is a huge amount of private violence, and the figures for that are higher. So by this playing up constitutes public violence or violence in public against women, or again by strangers, you play down private violence and you play down violence by people in your own family. What Vibhuti was explaining very clearly, you play down that, and we see that in the COVID time, it came out suddenly because people were not out. You had to talk eventually. The media was forced to talk about private violence, domestic violence, because the rates were high. But the rates are high even when there's no pandemic. But the media doesn't report on it. Doesn't mean, and this is the problem. If the media doesn't report on it, does it mean it doesn't exist? No, it exists, but you're only casting a lens on a certain part of it. And clearly, it's a worldwide phenomena. It's not just India. Many more women are killed at the hands of their intimate partners or family members. NCRB, National Crime Records Bureau, consistently shows that in India. We have that. The other thing is you also pay down this thing is stranger assaults, stranger rape cases in public spaces are only about 5 to 7%. Okay, by and large, in most reported rape cases, almost 95% cases, the offender knew the survivor. So but the media focus is really on those 7% kind of cases. So this is the other thing. So it's really important that because of who the media reports more on, what kinds of cases particularly reports more on, that the media, as media practitioners, we are more inclusive and intersectional as far as possible when we are covering rape, and paying attention to that, and pay attention to as much to private violence as to public violence. And clearly, and the pandemic, luckily for us, has brought that to the fore, and we're forced to confront that. Okay, other aspects which you need to focus on. The other thing the media often does is it does incident-driven rape reporting, which means it follows a particular incident, okay, till a point till it gets fed up of it, or it reaches court and the case is made out for it, or till a certain point. So they're really focused on that. So often the media's interest in violent crime sexual assault starts and ends with the individual story or episode, whether it was a Delhi gang rape in December 2012, the Shakti Mills gang rape in August 2013. The media usually focuses all its energy in pursuing a single rape or assault story, framing it as an isolated incident. As a result of episodic framing, it often misses out on the larger context of gender-based violence as a systemic issue. Okay? And some of the things you've learned today about patriarchy and gender, you have to understand the systemic violence against women. And in that context, look at rape. And so the one individual case is not sad. But really, the media really gets caught in this individual narrative, which does a disservice to the larger issue of gender justice. Instead, the focus is on what else can you do to broaden the story beyond that one individual narrative. For a few days, sticking with the story, particularly when it becomes a very political hot potato, is fine. But there are other unseen stories, there are other survivors, maybe the other aspects of the law or medical changes you could talk about. You could talk about the positive changes the law has brought in. You can look at the systemic violence against certain groups of women, particularly who are more vulnerable, whether they're disabled, marginalized, minority, whatever. So, it's important. Often a case happens after 2-3 days. It's important that journalists then drag the lens back and start looking at other issues around. Okay, so instead use thematic framing and the individual story to tell a wider story about the crime, the justice delivery system, medical, social, psychological issues. There are many issues linked to rape and sexual assault. The other thing is violating norms of privacy and identification. This constantly happens. The only thing the media is usually consistent about is not mentioning often the name of the victim or survivor. And what they do, they either change the name or they don't mention that person, whatever. But in this changing the name, they forget that the rule under section 228A of the Indian Code is actually removing all identifying details. So it's not just the name change, but all other kinds of things also which can help identify the person. And publishing photographs, disclosing identities of rape survivors is prohibited. This includes, identified details includes things like, name, of course, but details of residence, employment, education, particulars of friends or family members. In short, nothing should be done that compromises the identification safety of the rape survivor and deters other similar survivors from reporting the crime. Use pseudonyms instead. You can give a survivor's age and general background, a student, a working woman, but nothing very specific. So for example, this headline, we didn't think she tried rape, is from that case in April 2009, what is referred to as a TIS rape case, but it involves an international student to study at TIS and was gang raped by a group of male friends from those South Bombay colleges off campus, not on campus. This paper publishing and other papers also published the FIR in full on page 2, filled with details of the student's personal life. So while the student's name never came out, there were enough details in that FIR. And FIR has to be detailed for investigation, which the cops need to have. But her whole personal life and life on campus doesn't have to be in the media's domain. The sequence of events on the said night, all kinds of, who is our best friend, what is our hostel number, everything was revealed in that. So not relying, these are all identifying details. In fact, there was a legal case also against this paper. Then if you look at other things of this Bulandshahr rape case in 2016, when a mother and daughter on the way from, I think, Noida, I think was on their way to, to Bulandshahr, they were on the Delhi-Kanpur National Highway, they were assaulted and by a group of men. And what happened problematically, that the whole bunch of media people landed up at the ancestral village, but they also landed up at their house in Noida, which made it difficult for the girl to continue school. She couldn't go to the same school. The school asked her to leave. Neighbors asked, there's too much attention in our neighborhood. So they didn't want them to stay there. So too much attention. I mean, you're saying I'm not putting the person's name. I think mother, daughter, wife and daughter of an Ola cab driver. But, you know, you by and large, by your presence and your OB vans and everything, you made such a tamasha of the whole thing that you have broken the law in that sense. The pregnancy identification compromise to the point that the family is really traumatized. One trauma was the assault and they need to have justice. But the other trauma is all these people in their doorstep, and now they have to, and then she lost her schooling, they had to change house, the friend's house is changed. So this is what implications, I need to explain, media people need to know the implications of the kind of reporting they do and what happens to people's lives. So this is just one example. There are many examples like this. So what is really crucial is that we understand that not only press council guidelines on this coverage, but also there is actually a law, section 228A. All identifying details are prohibited by law. The FIR filed in a rape case cannot be one. FIR is a public document otherwise, but in rape cases where the trial is in camera, both the disclosure of judicial proceedings and identity of rape survivor is prescribed by law under section 228A. And then can one, this comes up often post the actually Nirbhaya case, because, you know, her name was Jyoti Singh Pandey, and she was given the name by the media Nirbhaya, like again, a pseudonym was given primarily because they couldn't name her. And then, she was severely injured and she died. And then the issue became that when survivor becomes a victim and they're no longer alive, what do we do? And there is a sort of anything called identifies how you can identify. Basically, her close family members have to say that they're okay with the name being used. And in this case, her family did. In the case of Jyoti Singh Pandey, her family said they would like her name to be. So there are these things. So there are lots of laws and rules. You have to, if you're following cases like this regularly as a crime report, a crime report normally would follow up rape cases. You need to be really intimately aware of the law. And I will come in later also to other aspects of the law which you need to know. The other thing is, besides, is this issue of moralizing tone. This comes in really, sometimes it's very blatant and very often it's very underhand. All kinds of things. So even you're reporting when other people are telling women what to do, don't work after 8 p.m., don't wear such clothes, don't eat chow mein, whatever. The media needs to intervene and make its case also to say that's not buying this kind of thing. When you use these broad headlines, what happens is there's a picture painted that everybody's agreeing with this. Don't work after 8 p.m., don't wear jeans, whatever, don't wear leggings, whatever. So you need, the media needs to constantly intervene in these articles when they're publishing that say this was said by so-and-so Khap Panchayat person or so-and-so politician, but we don't believe this kind of thing. You need to have a counterpoint of view, and this moralizing tone which gets in in the copy. So for example, they'll be saying, do we really need to know what the unnatural sex a survivor was subjected to during when the person was gangly, or that she smoked and drank, not necessarily at the moment of rape, but maybe before or after, whatever, or she wore a skirt, or any language, headlines, or story angle that suggests that the survivor of sexual violence encouraged the attack on themselves by something they did, wore, went, or said should be totally avoided. Don't treat survivors of gender-based violence, as being complicit in the act. Avoid casting aspersions on their behavior and individual characters. We rarely do that for perpetrators. So why are we doing it for people? In any other crime, you believe the people, you don't moralize and sermonize about it. But somehow everybody assumes that in sexual assault, it's free for all, and we can all say things about what she should have done, what was wrong with her, rather than say she was subjected to a crime and she deserved. So, and there's also this thing of painting survivors into categories. Often, your survivor sexual violence often either they fall in the category of virgins or vamps. So basically, you make out who's a good victim and who's a bad victim. You think these people, she went out to a pub and then she got assaulted while she was taking a ride home. That's a bad girl. It's a bad woman. She shouldn't have been out in the first place. So no wonder. So that is your vamp kind of character. And then your virgin is your very young girl who was very naive, who didn't seem to know. So the media makes up a narrative about them and says, okay, these are the people we kind of support and we don't. Now, they often don't do it directly, but indirectly, the kind of language they use, the adjective they describe, they slip it into copy. And this is really dangerous, and it's something which is should not be done at all. The other thing is sourcing. Where do you get your, so news sources are very important for journalists. Where do you get your information from? So rule of thumb, whether it's for rape story, any other story, avoid single source stories or anonymous sourcing as far as possible. Often in stories like that, you would say, but my single source is the cop. Often your single source is an official source, a police person who doesn't go on record, who wants to be anonymous. Now, this cannot be the norm in your reporting. You need to figure out other ways of getting information, or at least, try to get information from a variety of sources so that it's more credible, or at least get the information provided by one source, even if it's the police, substantiated in other ways. If you are pressed to go with a single source, present the information in a manner that the reader and viewer knows that not all of it is completely substantiated, and there is only one version of events. Okay. Ideally, avoid anonymous sourcing. It really undermines the credibility of a story. So a journalist who keeps doing anonymous sourcing is not taken seriously. You don't believe that person actually did the legwork or got that. Interviewing the right expert source is very important. So we often get expert sources to make a comment, but often we need to get the right experts. So just because it's a rape story or sexual violence doesn't mean you can just get anyone who works on women's rights, for example. Everybody in women's rights is not qualified to comment on a case of gender violence. Some people are women's experts, but they're experts on women's work. Some people are experts on women's environment, but there's some people who are experts on gender violence. So look at those experts, like Vibhuti right here. Look at the right medical, forensic, legal, psychological gender expert. If you regularly report on this, you should have a black book where you have these names of these organizations who do work. You already should be in touch with them. So you know that you can call them up and ask for guidance for how to report, to get a quote for them, whatever. But you need to get the right kind of expert. This is very important. The other thing is in terms of stop harassing survivors and their families as sources of information. Don't be that reporter that stalks the survivors' building, asking questions of the watchman present. By the way, I know reporters who've done that. While the law does not allow the media access to rape survivor families when the case is ongoing, it may be possible later. If you is often trauma, maybe you should go to a counselor, or you need to find the right way where you don't re-traumatize the survivor and the family. Let survivors and their families decide if they want to be interviewed or not, and how they wish to be attributed. Respect their boundaries, and if possible, show them a story if possible, whatever. So you need to be very respectful, be very mindful of that. The other thing is changing the vocabulary, really very important. Sensationalist headlines and wordings create a spectacle of the crime and disregard the dignity of the survivor. Only give details of crime that are strictly necessary. Favor the term survivor over victim when referring to a person who's being raped. As gender activists point out, the use of the word victim reinforces negative stereotypes of women as passive and weak. Avoid words and phrases that underplay the violence or play up gender stereotypes, such as the word eve teasing or sex pest. You do not use words like this. If you describe a sexual assault, don't make it sound like lovemaking. Rape or penetrated are more appropriate terms than had sex with. Avoid, because that's showing consent. So please be clear that the words you're using show that this was possible and was not non-consensual. Avoid use of words like fondled when meaning molested. So try to use as much legal terminology as possible, what the law calls it in that sense. Except for one law which still has this outdated thing of outraging modesty, which we're hoping, women's groups are hoping that we can change the wording of that, but it's not happened as yet. Avoiding vocabulary that in any way suggests the survivor deserved or enjoyed the assault, and language that can assign blame, such as describing a survivor as being dressed provocatively. You use the active voice when reporting crimes related to gender violence. People have said it before also. As this helps put the onus of the act specifically on the perpetrator. So it is better to say a 32-year-old man allegedly raped a 23-year-old woman than saying a 23-year-old woman was raped. Who was she raped by? Put the onus, get the perpetrator in the picture. We rarely try to get the perpetrator into our copy. When reporting violence against transgendered persons or sexual minorities, be very cautious how you refer to them. Do ask them what pronoun they prefer, how they would like to be described. Use the term transgender as an adjective, not as a noun. So say a transgender person, not a transgender. Avoid things like hermaphrodite. Instead, use intersex person, describe person whose biological sex is indeterminate at birth. There are more details available on this. There's lots of information now available on this kind of thing. But ideally, someone from the community of the transgender community and the person you are interviewing or talking to, who sort of says what they prefer. This story, for example, UN peacekeepers paid 13 of the sex. They couldn't have paid for. It's not sex. It's a rape of minors. So clearly you need to know what you're using. It's a crime in that sense. So call it what it is. Call it empirically by the. This story, which actually interestingly ran on Women's Day a couple of years ago, talks about a girl who's trying to escape a gang rape. And then they use this term. The girl did manage to retain her honor at the cost of. She had to jump off something and injure herself. Did manage to retain her honor. Now, retain her honor, it's nothing about honor. Vibhuti also mentioned this earlier. It is rape. She basically maybe prevented herself, an assault on herself. But to use the word honor, again, bringing that honor is a very problematic word and doesn't belong in news copy at all. Unless you're quoting someone else saying it, but the newspaper itself cannot use that as a word. And even if you quote someone else, please, it's good if you could have a balance and mention that this is a word not used by us, and we don't think that's the right appropriate language to use. Language is very critical. It can really change things, the way how you look at that crime. The other very important thing is reporters need to completely understand legal, medical, forensic, and evidence-related issues of a sexual assault case. And the main thing is not just because you're reporting, you sort of write the correct thing for your reader, but more importantly, you also ask important questions of the police. Very often, if you don't know the legal, medical, forensic, evidence-related laws, the cops are not telling you that. So you will ask the wrong questions, you will get wrong replies, and you will take it as the right reply, not realizing that you've actually been, never understood the law, so you never really understood it. I want to explain this in case of the Hathras case. In the Hathras case, for example, this thing they said rape has not happened because the FSL report, which is Forensic Science Lab report, showed that there was no rape. Now, the FSL report cannot show there's no rape. It talks very technical terms. FSL report is not a legal requirement to establish a rape. It's irrelevant to a legal case, actually. It can be corroborative if done in time. For example, in the Hathras case, the vaginal swab was done 8 days later in the Aligarh hospital. So after the survivor has bathed, whatever. So in that case, the report doesn't make any sense. It's irrelevant, actually. So the FSL report cannot be used to discount the possibility of rape. But if the report finds something conclusively, for example, use of force, injury mark, it can affirmatively confirm rape. But the lack of an FSL report or FSL report which is middle of the road, doesn't say it this way or that way, doesn't mean that rape is not established, that a case cannot go forward. Okay, but often policemen will tell you that. They will tell you, "Arey, bilkul nahi hua rape hua kyunki FSL report." But if you are a journalist who knows the law and knows how courts are viewing the FSL report, and laws have changed a lot in the last decade, post particularly the Justice Verma Committee thing, when the Criminal Law Amendment Act was passed in 2013. You need to understand what the law was before, what the law is now, and it keeps changing. Amendments are often made to laws, and you need to follow that. And I don't know whether I should go into the law. I had sort of put out a chart, but generally, so many people have talked about so many different laws. But with regard to sexual assault, a couple of basic things. Sexual offences against women above the age of 18 is registered under Indian Penal Code, IPC. Sexual offences against a person, boy or girl, under the age of 18 is registered under POCSO 2012. Prior to 2013, rape was defined in very narrow terms. It was defined as sexual intercourse, penovaginal penetration by a man with a woman without her consent. Oral sex or penetration by objects were totally excluded. And feminists have fought long battles to change the rape definition till the 2012 case happened in Delhi, and the Justice Verma Committee came, and in 2013 the law changed. Something which women's groups have been pushing for a long time, but the amendments came in 2013. Now, under this, the whole definition of rape has changed, and it includes, besides vaginal penetration of the vagina, urethra, anus by objects, fingers, whatever, and it includes oral sex. So really, you need to know the law, because very often someone, maybe a lawyer or a cop or whatever, who maybe will try to say something else to you. But if you are a journalist, you don't know. You need to know it, If you cover this area, you need to know and understand. It's not rocket science. If you pay attention, you can. Then about minimum punishment, the new offenses were added in 2013, which is very important. Before that, before 2013, we did not have acid attacks, voyeurism, stalking as crimes. They were incorporated in the IPC. There's issues about evidence, the issues about medical issues, the two-finger test, which everybody keeps talking about, but it's totally irrelevant. Rape cases being done away with totally. So you need to understand what is the importance of medical examination, or how important is it or not important. Many of these things do not carry weight in a court of law. The courts now look at it very differently. So you need to pay attention to this. The other thing is, I'm almost going to finish soon, so we can ask questions. The other thing is images. Okay, images, or very often, because you can't use photographs along with stories when you're reporting rape. Very often, newspapers have this stockpile of illustrations with some person in-house has done, and the same illustration accompanying every story regarding rape forever, for the next decade or 2 decades. And it's really, most often you really cringe at these illustrations accompanying the rape story. Usually there's a larger-than-life hand pushed against a woman's face. Lots of uses of hands pushed against, illustrations of that. Or in the case of child sexual assault, they often have a child, a little girl, illustration of a girl with a teddy bear to show us it's underage person. Sometimes you choose a married woman, they will show a smeared bindi or sindoor smeared. So these are illustrations we're trying to tell you what the story. So there's a stockpile, most newspapers have terrible illustrations. And I think rarely do you even see, and the shocking thing of this is, I mean, I don't know if this stands out to you, but when you look at these images again and again, you realize what is really missing. What is missing? The missing is there's no illustration of a perpetrator, except for that hand, which could be. There's never a reflect. So use images, and this is very mindful in the days today with digital imagery, so many things you can do on a computer desktop. Use images that reflect resilience and strength. You can show images, or you can definitely show photographs citizens protest against rape, not images that portray women as helpless, passive victims. We're trying to show community spirit, people coming together, fighting against rape, changing a law. There's so many other ways to use photographs and images, but definitely these kind of images should be avoided. Finally, I would say, very important, the media stops implying that the case is fake or made up. This is a often done thing with sexual assault. No other, as I said earlier, no other crime is a person who files the complaint blamed so much for the crime. In burglary, no other crime are you blamed for. In real estate issues, is that you are never blamed for it. You file a complaint that I have been wrong. But if someone, a woman or sexual assault survivor files a complaint, or a family does, it's considered something is wrong with you. And or this is fake, you are making it up. So most rape survivors are not believed when they speak out about their experiences. And thus they often hesitate to file cases. And though we have a number of reported cases has gone up, remember these are only reported cases we know. We still know a lot of women who choose not to file, mainly for reasons related to this. Tagging their experiences as fake cases is a popular argument to discredit the very real experience of rape faced by so many women, both inside and outside the house. Most reported cases of sexual violence are not fake. There's too much at risk for women who speak up, and journalists need to get familiar with the actual statistics of rape and actual condition of what causes that. So and when people tell me, oh, but these laws are misused by women, I have to say all laws are misused by everyone. Okay, so the wealthiest people in this country misuse real estate law or corporate taxation law. You're evading tax, so everybody's evading. There's always a percentage, but in law terms, okay, out of every 100 cases, there are 3%, 4% cases misuse. But the way you treat it in rape cases, it's almost like 100% of the people cannot be believed. So be realistic about the number of fake cases. But the way media reports often of fake cases, it almost looks like that number is more. So please start believing women. There are many more sensitive ways for the media to cover rape and sexual harassment of women and girls without invading their privacy and trauma survivors, and focusing the story as much, if not more, on the perpetrators. It is important the media and journalists understand that the rape story is not about sex, it is about power and opportunity. The emphasis needs to be on consent, not on the models of the survivor. One needs to look at the systemic abuse and look at this from an intersectional perspective. We can definitely do this better. And I hope you will. Thank you.
Thank you, Sameera. That was really very, very insightful. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Sameera. Sameera, we have a question for you. Ridhima, can you please unmute yourself and take the question on with Sameera, please? Ridhima is there?
Okay.
Hello.
I'll ask the question. Yeah, Ridhima is there.
Hi. So the question was for my previous when Ms. Leena Pujari was there. However, I want to ask one question here as well.
Yeah.
Am I audible?
Sure. Yeah, you are. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. So a lot of times what happens is that the data is also missing, especially now. So how do we find the proper data in case of even in after COVID and pandemic, there's not been a lot of data, and whatever data is already there is less reported. So how do we find the proper data and how do we report such crimes?
So the data, I don't know what you mean, but data is, I mean, the filed cases data is with individual police stations, but also nationally or submitted to the NCRB. So you will get data through the National Crime Records Bureau. Every police station in the country files data with them. So data is available. Also, if you actually go in touch with, say departments, let's say at TIS, for example, people look at departments which look at certain kind of gender-based crime or gender and other employment, gender and something. People look at so many different. If you talk to professors, academics who work on that area, they will know what the latest databases they're looking at, or what is available, or their own paper, or share their academic work. So academics is a very important way. Any academic who works in the area of gender-based violence would be aware of what kind is available. But in the public domain, NCRB is your best bet. Always go to NCRB statistics usually.
And also NFHS, National Family Health Survey, is a massive.
National Health
I'm the chairperson of its IRB, and we know the way we scrutinize, and 25,000 households in one state are interviewed. An exhaustive interview is there. So I think NFHS data also currently, in the absence of a head count provided by census, is not there. NFHS and NCRB, they are the most reliable data sources. Though,
if I can, if I can just rephrase my question for better answer. So I want especially for workplace harassment. So there is no data for unorganized sector because ICCs, there is no proper data. So in cases of these reporting, how can we go and get data to report better?
Area studies, case studies, area studies, shop floor level union, keeping in touch with the union and the women's organization, working with the informal sector like SEVA, VAGO, IDWA, All India Democratic Women's Association, NFIW. That's the only source to get it, because where they get organized and they, so shop floor level lot is happening, but the centralized data we don't have. At a macro level and meso level data we don't have. Micro data we have. Yeah, only district level. So like Bombay is divided, for example, Mumbai is divided into 2 sections, and then there's you can file complaints of unorganized sector workers, but of course it's very few filed. So I think Anaga Sarpudar is in charge of Bombay. I think yes,
Bombay,
she's
so you have to find the person who's in charge of that of the sexual harassment in the unorganized sector.
Local complaints.
Local.
LCC,
but Vibhuti is right. Central level data for that is not available. It is very localized. You have to go district wise. They will tell you what is filed with it. Doesn't mean this is the amount. The amount probably is much more, and that's why unfortunately all the databases eventually fall short because of really it's about the ones which are reported. The National Family Health Survey data is very, because it goes household by household. The researchers go. So that is different. The person didn't have to go and file. They went and asked. So that is very, very important data, along with census, which is currently, unfortunately, not available.
Okay, the next question is for Dr.
Good afternoon. Can I kindly add something to the debate? Because I have been working on issues like women harassment. So I want to add some more points to it, if I'm allowed.
Please go
Sure,
ahead.
Please go ahead.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, I am Muntaha Hafiz. I work as an independent journalist from Kashmir. Currently, I'm pursuing my PhD in media and communications. So the one who asked the question, because I was also working on the same topic, I have been a part of it since last 5 years now. You, like ma'am said, it happens at the local levels. The data you can, get at the local databases, such as Women's Commission. They always, have their reports at the end of the every financial year. They have the reports. In those reports it's always mentioned the number of violence related or women related crimes. They always register it. Especially you can go to local police stations police stations always have a data about violence, and also there is a crime bureau in every state, I believe. You can go there also you can get the data. Thank you so much.
You are right.
Thank you.
That's what I have used in my PPT. You must have noticed. I have used the data from helplines and National Commission for Women, State Commission for Women. And the
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay. Now our next question is for Dr. Vibhuti from Santoshi. Can you please unmute yourself and put across your question, please? Santoshi.
Yeah, hi.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I had the question when Leena ji was talking then, that how do we distinguish? There is a very thin line, it seems, that about being a feminist and matriarchy. How do we distinguish that?
Matriarchy is not there on this planet. There was a time, anthropologists, anthropographers, they are saying that there was a time where there was a matriarchy, mother-centered organization of society. What we have is a matrilineage in some of the northeastern states. We also used to have matrilineage in Kerala. But feminism is a philosophy, and those who are committed feminists, they fight against any form of violence, subjugation, injustice, discrimination, and exclusion, individually or as a collective. So it is, you don't have to be biologically woman to become feminist. Even men can be feminist because anyone who believes in changing the society and changing the subordinate status of women in the society and in all walks of life, they all are feminists. But matriarchy, as the anthropologists say, currently it is not there. Matrilineage is there in some African societies, some of the primitive tribes, and some northeastern tribes. Predominantly everywhere, it is a patriarchy. And matrilineage is consistent with patriarchy. So matrilineage, mother, inheritance right is from mother to daughter, but still the decision making is by mama, maternal uncle, as it was among the Nair communities and also in Meghalaya, Nagaland, and in fact, they are the most resistant for giving the 33% reservation to women in Panchayati Raj institutions. These are the two states, Kashmir and Nagaland, which have not accepted Panchayati Raj Act because they don't want women in public life.
Okay, our next, we have one more last question. I think Purnima, is Purnima? This question is for Sameera. Purnima, kindly unmute yourself and please take the question.
Hi, my name is Purnima. I'm an independent journalist. I have been trying to preach a story that is about rape cases of tribal women in West Bengal. But I've been publishers have been rejecting it, saying it is not relevant now. It's not a big issue. Why should we report it now? So is there any famous personality supporting this cause? And there have been protests by the people from this community, students and youngsters. So I told them, but they don't want to take it. So is there anything that I could, any tips that you could share that I can modify my pitch that, that maybe convince them to take it seriously?
Purnima, I couldn't hear you clearly, but you say there's you call it a tribal woman's rape case in West Bengal.
Yeah. Tribal women, can you hear me now?
Yeah, tribal, and nobody is willing to buy that picture.
Yeah, 3 publishers, they rejected the story. Yeah,
so one of the reasons the media ends up covering metropolitan rapes or urban or middle class women is because always, publications say, oh, that's our average reader. They're interested in stories about them, like people like themselves. They're not interested in, they're not so interested in, issues with involving Adivasis or, lower caste people or things. So it is very difficult. So one is that it's not that journalists are not willing to write on these things, but often they, editors of publication will not carry these stories or not too many of these stories. They say it is a chance. So usually what happens is you will find a news peg. You will find something current news, something which has happened. So for example, election is a great time. Because election, when people put out their manifesto and say they're promising all these women these rights or violence against women, then you bring out some case and say, but in this case, for example, nothing happened. And what would the local politician have done or whatever? So you peg it to a local election or a larger election, or you peg it to another crime which is taking place in that neighborhood or in that same state, and which is also involves the tribal person, and say, okay, now these are you already have existing cases which nothing has happened of. For example, this case, which I've been interested in, So often you go back and say, okay, now this has happened, but I already have a previous story where these cases are unresolved or whatever. So you often have to look for the right news spec. A law has changed. Someone has come and someone has spoken about this big statement, a big hoo-ha on social media. So you say, okay, but my story is connected. You find some tangential connection. All journalists specialize in this. Okay, I can peg it to this. You would peg your story to something which is current and happening and say, okay, this story. So sometimes do your research and keep it ready and keep asking around for more publications which are more analytical or maybe longer term. But for the daily newspapers and magazines which are more, you really have to hold on sometimes to something for a little while and say, okay, I have a story, you're not going to publish it, but what about if this happened then, So you wait for the something else to happen, which you can connect your story, and say, this story belongs. So that's new, it's called finding a news peg. And that's what the papers want to be relevant. So if you can do that to a news peg, say I'm pitching it because ABCD has happened and it's connected to that. So that's it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we come to an end to these questions here. Moving on to the next. Most of all, let me thank Sameera and Professor Vibhuti Patel for an insightful session. Thank you so much, ma'am. It was a great having you both here with us today. So moving on to the next session, my dear participants, I hope all of you are taking your notes with great inputs. Our next and last session for the day is on reporting on people with disability and will be taken by Srinidhi Raghavan. Let me introduce you to her. She's a feminist writer, researcher, and a trainer. She works at intersections of sexuality, gender, disability, and technology. She has co-led programs at Rising Flame. Her work focuses on deepening conversations around sexuality, on rights of persons with disabilities, and building more spaces where disabled people can thrive. Thanks, Srinidhi. Please take over.
Thank you so much, Malti. Hi, thank you for that introduction. So I don't have a presentation for the next 45 minutes. And what I would like to do is I would break in between itself so that we can go through questions as and when they occur and throughout the session, if that would be okay with others. So you could, I'll pause and you can either unmute yourself or ask the question in the chat box and I'll respond to those. Yeah. Okay. So I'll really, I think beginning with the most basic question that often plagues a lot of us is, what do we call disabled people? What language do we use in the media? And this is one of the things that consistently we see, is that the language that is used to speak about people with disabilities and disabled people is very, very offensive. It often it ranges from mentally challenged to physically challenged to crazy to psychotic, insane. All these words are surrounded around how we report on people with disabilities specifically. And one of the things that we see in practice is that there is no uniformity. So there is very little even disability rights organizations like Rising Flame can even do to bring together information on what is the current status of reporting on people with disabilities, because it is almost impossible to find any uniformity. And one of the things that is helpful and useful to have in place is to use the language that the law uses. And that is, the law uses the legislation that caters to disabled people is the Rights of Persons with Disabilities legislation. This was which came into place in 2016, which replaced an older legislation. But uniformly, according to the law, we still use language like person with disabilities. And this is at the core of how we will think about the next 40-ish minutes of our conversation. And just to think about the ways in which we use language in itself. So if we think about the two words that I have been using since I began, and one of them is person with disabilities and the other is disabled person. And these in our practice many disability rights organizations and disabled people themselves use these two words interchangeably. And this is primarily because it caters to two different ideas of how we perceive disability, which is that person with disability is the language that is being used there is called person first language, where it is assumed that the person is of importance, and thus we will use person with disability specifically. And there is disabled people, which a lot of disabled people self-identify as disabled people, including myself. And one of the reasons is because the language, it assumes in it, when we say disabled person or disabled woman or disabled feminist, that many of us believe that the word disability does not have negative connotations in our lives, that we are not less because we're disabled. So the assumption that the value of the person doesn't exist because of the fact that there is disabled in used first is one of the reasons why many people claim the word to identify as disabled persons, very similar to queer people claiming queer. It's also similar to a lot of blind people, and the community identifies as the blind community, very clearly articulating that this is something that we are and we are not ashamed of it, right? And similarly for the deaf community, it is something that universally across the community, they do believe that they should be called deaf, right? And not deaf and hard of hearing, and not speech impaired or hearing impaired, etc. For example, to give an example of this situation, is that, for instance, if you see the disability department in India is called the Divyang Jan department in India. And when a lot of disabled people have been protesting the language that is used, because Divyang Jan in many ways is to say that the body, I mean, for those who aren't familiar with Hindi, it does mean divine body if you break up Divyang Jan. And this assumption that disabled people are divine is an assumption that actually caters against disabled people and does not further or support disabled people's opportunities, etc. Right. One of the things that, I'll just break for 2 minutes in case anybody has any questions so far. Yeah, sure. Somebody's hand is raised.
I am already confused about using the terminology.
Sorry, your voice is not clear.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So I have been always confused, every time we use the terminology, differently abled or challenged, sort of, because some newsrooms allow, but some newsrooms say that no, we don't use these terms. But when you speak to people, they have different, idea about it. So could you please speak on that?
Okay. To speak about it from the larger perspective, the assumption when we say differently abled is we are locating, quote unquote, the problem within the body of the disabled person, right? So we are saying that you are differently abled. You need the world to be different in order to function, right? So the problem then is being located within an individual. And that is one of the reasons why a lot of disabled people don't use language like differently able, specially abled, etc. Right? And you will notice this extensively when we write, articles come up about either violence that they face or work that we do, etc. Right? Like I want to give an example. We did at Rising Flame, we did a research during COVID, which was called Neglected and Forgotten. And it was to specifically attend to the forms of discrimination and violence that women with disabilities faced during the pandemic. And this was during the first wave. And every newspaper article that we spoke to talk about this research, we would use language like disabled person, people with disabilities. And when they are using language about us, it would be when when it is not directly quoting us, the language would return to differently abled, specially abled, etc. Right? So it is almost a way to assert that the problem is here, right? But whereas when we claim the identity of people with disabilities, which is the language that is used not just by Indian law, but international law, right? So it is the United Nations Convention on Rights of People with Disabilities, right? It is not United Nations Convention on Rights of Differently Abled People, right? So this idea of what locates it, it also comes back to one of the problems that I will broadly discuss as we go ahead, which is the fact that when we say differently abled or specially abled, what are we saying? We are claiming that the non-disabled person is the normal. This is the normal, and anybody who deviates from the normal is different. Anybody who deviates from this doesn't actually require the normal status, right? Like, how do we use language around this? And this happens to us on an everyday basis. I had recently given an interview for a nonprofit run magazine, right? And I identified as a disabled feminist in that. And I received an email from a person I do not know telling me that I should call myself differently abled, right? Because I am because of the fact that disabled means that I am thinking that I am less than another person, right? And the assumption in that language is that disability connotates lack. Disability connotates less value, right? And so you're trying to protect the person by saying, I will protect you from what everybody else thinks of you by calling you differently abled. But if you call me differently able, does that mean that staircases will become ramps? No. Does that mean that our library books will have braille books? No. Does it mean government notifications will suddenly be screen reader accessible? No. So the core of the problem is that, and what disabled people say is that the problem is not us. The problem is that society is not conducive to anybody who's not quote unquote normal. So if you bend society or you add reasonable accommodations in society, then the chances are that I will be included in society, right? And the biggest problem around this is that we are considered to be a minority, right? And that is the reason why our needs and what we deserve to have aren't catered, right? But according to census, which is 2011 census that was done last, there are about 26.8 million disabled people in India. And when this census was counted, the disability legislation only included 7 types of disabilities. The disability legislation that is in force at the moment includes 21 types of disabilities. So basically, you can imagine that the number of 26.8 million will be multiplied by 3 at least minimum, which means that those many disabled people exist in our country at the moment. And how are we catering to this group in general is the question that we will talk about in the next few minutes, right? And broadly, at the percentage that we are seeing, 26.8 million, even if we take that at the moment, it is basically 2.2% of India's population, right? But globally, World Health Organization estimates that disability is underreported because of the fact that we self-report disability, right? And the prevalent stigma that exists in society means that we don't report disability according to the numbers that actually exist. So if you go to a household and ask somebody, ask the parent, let's say you're asking the head of when you go to do census, you go to the household and you ask them, is there a disabled person in this house? Chances are they will say no, right? Even if there is a disabled person in this house. So that percentage is off by 13 percentage points is what is estimated globally. That we across the world are seeing roughly 2.2%, but in actuality, it is at least 15%. Right? And this number, thanks to COVID-19, has changed dramatically. We are seeing large numbers of people become disabled because of the pandemic, because of illnesses, right? And this means that the number will grow. But does that mean that we as a society are accommodating enough of this number is the question we really need to ask. Yeah. And what is assumed if we think about gender and disability is that globally 1 in 5 women live with disabilities, right? And what then happens to all these women with disabilities? Where are they? Where are they in terms of the leaders in our country? Where are they in terms of how much we speak about them within the women's movement? Where are they in terms of how we talk about them in media? What are the concerns of women with disabilities that we see that are underreported, not reported, don't exist? Yeah. And in general, yeah. And this is something that the women with disabilities across the world have been saying for decades now, that we fall through the cracks because the women's rights movement does not have space for women with disabilities often, because our needs are very specific. When accommodating people with disabilities, the costs are higher because you need to find that one location that is accessible, etc. To give an example, we were hosting our national leadership program in the capital city of this country. So we were in Delhi, and we were running our national leadership program, which is only for women with disabilities. And so it was a group of 8 women with disabilities plus 4 facilitators who were also women with disabilities. So there was 12 women with disabilities. There was not one hotel in the capital city of this country that had more than one wheelchair accessible room. So if we had to accommodate, and among the 12 women with disabilities that were in the room, we needed 3 wheelchair accessible rooms. We weren't able to find a hotel that was this. So the easiest route is to find a 5-star hotel that will have some facilities to bridge the gap between access and inaccessible spaces, right? And this means then that women with disabilities have to put themselves in situations that are unsafe, right? Like, think about all the healthcare facilities that women visit for x-rays, for scans of their ovaries, for pregnancy scans, for everything. How many hospitals in our country have tables and chairs and equipment that will move up and down so a wheelchair woman can transfer herself by herself, right? I mean, the question I think first should be, how many hospitals will have entrances that are without steps, that have clear access to locating and traveling in the rooms, right? And yet we don't see media reportage about this. We don't understand, or we don't have enough conversation around the ways in which it damages access to the world for women with disabilities. Right? So if you cannot have access to a healthcare center, the chances are, or if you have access to an inaccessible healthcare center, the chances are that you will reduce how often you go to the doctor, right? Which means that the number of health conditions you have increases, right? So what inaccess does is not just about the fact that I'm not able to be in a particular place. It means that that my access to the world and opportunities reduces, right? That my self-esteem reduces. We recently did a story as part of our media fellowship for along with Behan Box, and the story was on access. And in one of them, the person who was one of the women who spoke about her own experience of going to school as a wheelchair user was that she never left her chair for the entire time that she was in school. She would be dropped into her wheelchair on the table for her classroom, and that's it. So she did not have access to the toilet. Because the toilets were not accessible in her school. She did not have access to games. She did not have access to socialization, because who's going to give up being in the classroom, or will be in the classroom through lunch breaks, tea breaks, etc. And imagine the number of issues that come up from this situation. There is isolation, which means that for a large part of women, for many women with disabilities, isolation is a very big reality, in the sense that there is, for many of them, they're the only disabled person they know till they grow up and look and search for community, right? And there's lots of mockery that happens for disabled people. Oh, wo langda yahan ja raha tha, wo ye kar rahi thi, usko dikhta nahi hai, tumhe samajh mein nahi aata hai, etc. You know, and these kinds of violence is peppered all throughout, from going to school, etc. But even if we take this one case of this person who was not able to move and access the toilet, right? What does that mean? It means that she was in a diaper throughout her life, right? Which increases her risks of urinary tract infections, right? What happens when she's menstruating? What does that do for her, right? And these are some of the questions that we need to begin to ask, because if and like a lot of people were saying earlier, we don't have data for this, right? Women with disabilities aren't really studied, so we don't have data for it. Like, for instance, NCRB data, which is freely available for the number of instances of violence faced by women, we don't have disaggregated data on how many of these were women with disabilities, how many of these were deaf women, how many of these were blind women. We don't have the data. And the one study that was done by Human Rights Watch, which was led by my colleague Nidhi Goyal, which was to study the ways in which the rape legislation, the sexual assault legislation, which is one of the very few legislations that talks about women with disabilities and the accommodations they need, right? Like, what happens to, how will a blind woman, for instance, if she is sexually assaulted? As per the law, a lot of the checks are to pick somebody out of a lineup, right? Which is a visual cue, right? How is a blind woman supposed to choose? Okay, so the law allows for a blind woman to be able to have an audio cue, for her to hear the voice of the perpetrator, right? And this was specifically included within the sexual assault legislation, which is great, right? But how badly is it implemented? So the study, which was done 5 years after the after Criminal Law Amendment 2018, it's the last study we have done to understand what happens to women with disabilities when they need to access justice, right? So the connotation of that there is no data is a very, very real situation. But as somebody who also writes, and somebody who has been working on this for a while, I think one of the things that really helps for me is to reimagine what data means, right? It doesn't necessarily mean numbers. It means lived experiences of women with disabilities in our newspapers, in our TV channels, in our everyday consumption of media, right? And that is something that is still very much not universally accessible, right? It is not something that we see very often. Yeah. I'll just break for 2 minutes if anybody has any doubts or questions. Before I... No, no thoughts? No questions? Oh, okay, yeah.
Go first. Should I go first? I think Akansha also wants to speak. I just wanted to know whether Rising Flame has done any, research on health or the health aspects you spoke about. For example, like, women do not have access to toilets, so they have to be on diapers for a long period. What happens to them when they're menstruating? So the chance of infection actually rises. So has there been any kind of research, any kind of data on these lines? Maybe we can do the story or write about it,
I'm going to paste in the chat box a list of articles that we did as part of our fellowship project called Spotlight, which basically covered very big issues, and these pieces did well, right? We did our initial piece was on abortion and what happens to women with disabilities when they ask for abortions, right? And you can see that, I mean, the stories are very clear. And one of my points of contention is that anecdotal information is considered as not enough. But what these long form pieces, each of them is about 3,000 words. And what these long form pieces tell us is that the situation is not great, right? That we don't have access to sign language interpreters in police stations or in healthcare centers. So a deaf woman cannot by herself access an abortion. She will need to be, it has to be mediated by somebody, right? And we know already that women in general, when they ask for abortions, it is mediated by family members, in-laws, husband, etc., right? But what happens when you cannot communicate with the doctor? The agency is completely absent, right? And decisions are made for women then without, for disabled women then without any choice that they have, right? And but the point of the question is not to say that, look, oh, so sad, disabled women have no rights, right? The point of contention is, what are we going to do to fix it? What are we going to demand for, right? How many sign language interpreters does India have on a whole, right? Like as an entire country, how many do we have? We don't have enough, right? And what is happening to generally, what is the state of access that is there, right? Like we've had Accessible India campaign now for this June 2022. It was supposed to make India fully accessible, right? And I mean, even anecdotally, we know this is not true, right? And when a research was done, a study was done in 2018 about accessibility in India, we found that it was 3% of the buildings across the country are accessible. That percentage is minuscule, right? And that means that some of the questions that we are asking also need to be posed to government authorities, need to be posed to people who are working on social justice, right? So it is a uniform question that we need to ask, right? I'm also pointing to very specifically the barriers that we see women with disabilities face, primarily because those are heavily excluded, right? We do talk about accessibility in general in society, right? But we are not thinking about the ways in which accessibility is related to safety for women with disabilities. And one of the pieces, a blind woman says that she often has to have Google Maps on her phone when she's outside alone. So she always knows where she is, right? So she's not somehow by mistake in a location that she is not. And a lot of non-disabled women will relate to the vigilance of being outside, right? But the idea that safety and accessibility are neatly tied together is something that we must think about, right? And many women with disabilities complain that when they have to be transported from one location to another, they're treated as baggage, right? A very popular disabled feminist, Anita Gai, when she was traveling in a flight, they refused to bring her wheelchair to the flight. So she was made to crawl on the runway, right? So this is not decades ago. This is nothing. This is right now. Like less than 5 years ago, she filed a complaint against the authority, right? So I think the conversations also need to be around how does this impact women with disabilities, and how does gender and disability then become something that is more complicated, right? Like for instance, a disability identification process, the process of getting a disability ID, so you can get access to benefits, social security benefits. If you are registering, say, a complaint of sexual assault, and you don't have a disability ID, then the chances are higher that the police will deny registering you as a disabled woman when the process is happening, right? So disability ID is very important. But they have moved disability certification to a digital certification, right? The percentage of women who have access to internet, digital, to mobile phones, etc., is definitely lower than for men. But for non-disabled women, the percentage is much, much lower. Right? So then it means that you don't have access to a certification. So then what happens to accessing or using rights, right? And being able to access pension, which is not a lot of money, but it is, I mean, because it varies between 200 rupees a month to 3,000 rupees a month across the country, right? So it's not a lot of money, but for a lot of people, that is very essential to survival. So I think it's important to ask intersecting questions around what happens to women with disabilities when these situations occur, right? Like for instance, if the pension is directly transferred to a woman with disabilities bank account, right? How many ATMs are wheelchair accessible? How many ATMs are accessible to blind people that don't have touch screens, right? And these are questions we take for granted because we aren't asking these questions universally, which means what will a disabled woman do? She will ask somebody else to draw money for her. That increases her vulnerability for economic violence. Somebody might draw the money and keep it for themselves, right? So even if I ask family member, but it's heavily possible that the money that she is getting, which is her right, is not accessible to her because of the system which disables her continuously. So I think each topic that we think about, it's important to think, how does this intersect with gender and disability, right? What happens to this story if I add gender and disability into the mix, right? And that I think is as important or maybe even more important than writing stories about people with disabilities, right? Those are of course important and they need to be done. We need to do more research. We need to have more lived experiences in public. But it is essential for us to also think about this in every story that we think about, right? Yeah, sorry, Akanksha, you have your hand up.
Yes. So now when we are talking about gender and when we are talking about disability, so when in terms of talking about what we used to see, ke murgi aana ya fir what we say mata chana, what we have connected to magico or what we have connected to religion. So what is the connection with disability and how do we like tell and spread awareness towards it? Like the person needs to get a medical like checkup or progress, like know about it. So how do we solve this problem that have been from like generations and still follow ke pagal ho gaya ya fir ye ho gaya? So we put everything onto religion and that's like very absurd at the point.
Thank you for asking that question. It really brings me to our next idea about disability, which is stigma, right? And the stigma is very high. Pre-pandemic, we were my colleague and I were in Varanasi because we were working on a project in rural Uttar Pradesh, which is true everywhere else, but I'm just using the example of rural Uttar Pradesh. And we were interacting with a group of 30 disabled young people. And we were introduced to them based on the disability that their families or the organization that we had partnered with thought they had. And one of the biggest things we found was that there was no access to disability identification. Everybody was mad, right? It was entirely possible that the child was deaf and was assumed to be intellectually disabled because he didn't speak or hear. Because the infrastructural requirements for disability identification is intensive. But the problem is that as a society, we continue to believe that disability equals to something missing, something lacking, as well as something wrong with my karma, right? And this is one of the reasons why the government of India decided to call people with disabilities Divyangjan, right? It was to counter the stigma, to say, no, they are not bad people, they are divine, right? But that is not a solution. It is not, you cannot replace one with the other and expect that the stigma will go away, right? It doesn't. But one of the root causes of the stigma, and that remains, is how we see disabled people in media, right? Growing up, if you think about just all the fairy tales that you have read, every person who has facial scars, who has the Hunchback of Notre Dame, who is assumed to be evil. Then there are I'm not getting, like, even like popular references, Batman had Scarface. Anybody in media, we see the trope of the fact that they are disabled, so they are very scary, or they're disabled and they're very inspirational, which is basically Professor X in X-Men. So you either overcome your disability and become great, or your disability is something that has made you evil, right? And at the core of both, what we see is discrimination. So the reason I'm using media examples is also because we don't have representation in our films, in our books, in our TV serials, where disability is seen as just a normal part of life. It's seen as at the core of diversity. It's not, it's just absent, right? So when it is absent, we are taking to what we assume to be superstitions, assume to be stereotypes, right? And these will pervade our understanding and our existence, because that is just how it is perceived. And so if we are looking to challenge the existing stereotypes and perceptions, we need to actively build other representation, right? And that will only happen if we have more disabled people in these spaces, more disabled people speaking about their experiences of just living, right? Of their experiences of getting married, having children, being mothers, of being leaders, and that these are not exceptions to any rule, but they're just part of people who live in society. Any questions at this point? Yes, Nusrat.
Audible?
Yeah.
Yeah, my question to you is that how do you see disabled women, caught in domestic violence, who do not have, access to the legal system or the police system itself, they're not able to assess that on time. So how do you see, them, their experiences or their struggle, that way?
Thank you for raising that question. I want to go one step back to ask, what does domestic violence for disabled women look like? Is it the same as it is for non-disabled women? Actually, the answer is no. Because a lot of what we are seeing and what we have heard over the years of speaking to disabled women across spectrum age groups, we see it manifests itself in very, very different ways. For instance, one of the biggest ways is denial of medication that might be essential, right? Which is not, according to our legislation, necessarily counted as domestic violence, right? It often is hiding her crutches or her wheelchair, so she is bound to the bed and is not able to move, right? Is, like I was saying, accessing all her pension and her salary because the ATMs are inaccessible for her. So in practice, the forms of violence that women with disabilities face, which are within the home, are very different. Primarily also because of the fact that they are dependent on family members for care, right? If there is somebody if there's a disabled woman who uses, say, wheelchair or crutches, she might need assistance or support in doing her daily activities, right? So brushing her teeth, combing her hair, having a bath, eating her meals. And that level of dependence then makes it much harder for her to think about complaining. Because, and all of what we have seen is what you are saying, that it is harder for women with disabilities to complain. And when they complain, one of the things that we are seeing is that often the police station folks tell them, if you complain about your family, where will you go? Who will help you? Right? So the arbitrary notion of health as survival means that it's harder for them to complain. Yeah. But what we see is that many disabled women do complain, but once they have access to that information, right? And much of the work that organizations across India, many, and there are quite a few organizations that work with women with disabilities, and it could be specific, right? Like some organizations work with women with intellectual disabilities only. Some organizations work with women with mental illnesses who are in psychiatric institutions. Some work with women across states and in rural locations. Like us, we work with women across. We do leadership both in urban locations as well as in rural locations. And what we see is that once they have the information, they do want to be able to chart what would happen next, right? But in many ways, we have to look at it as a few steps back, right? It is about identifying the violence first. Because if all my life something has been denied to me, the chances are that I will not identify it as violence, right? That I will not see that this is something I need to go to the police for. Or imagine that if I go to the police, somebody will believe me, right? And as a society, we anyway think that family is sacred. Parents deserve our respect and love and adoration, right? What happens then to disabled women who are being discriminated or oppressed within the home, right? So this is not going to be an easy one-way shift, right? And it is layered. Maybe it is a few steps behind what non-disabled women experience, right? But it requires us to work at multiple levels, work with women with disabilities to identify violence, report about this violence so that women with disabilities know, oh, that is an act of violence being perpetrated against me, right? And in this way, it really is specifically addressed to these kinds of situations, right? So it in practice allows for us to see how can you strengthen the ecosystem that she exists within so that she will be able to complain, but also so that when she complains, she will be believed, right? We know for a fact that many disabled women do complain and do file court cases against all odds, right? And this is primarily because there are many disability rights organizations called DPOs, which is Disabled People's Organizations, all over India in small clusters. And they are like rural-ish. They are present in both urban and rural locations, but they are very strong and networked in that sense. We see that women do come forward and complain to these locations. So then the support is provided one way or the other, right? But I think the reason that I wanted to go back is also to understand that the work has to be done, of course, for disabled women to come forward and use the justice system, but work also has to be done to strengthen the justice system and every step of the process, right? Say a deaf woman comes to complain in a police station. How is she going to complain if we don't ensure that police stations have access to sign language interpreters' numbers? Forget everything else, right? If they don't have access to sign language interpreters' numbers, how are they going to understand the disabled? So the layers of work that has to happen for access to justice for disabled women is more, but it requires us to do it at every level, right? I hope that answers your question. Just to answer to Sarah's question in this thing, much of what I have shared is not just urban locations, but also rural. A lot of the response during the pandemic was that rural women did not have access to their pensions, which was given to them because they couldn't go out, right? And sometimes the urban and rural divide is definitely worse. Like, for instance, public health centers might not have access to scanners or the equipment needed for disabled women to access. So this is definitely true in rural locations, but it is often also true in urban locations, right? One of the things that we see is that women with disabilities in rural locations have to travel long distances before they access prosthetics or they access wheelchairs, etc. So the commuting distances are much higher. So often they don't use wheelchairs and navigate the location on their knees, on their legs, etc. Education across the system is difficult to isolate, but I'm sure that rural locations education this past 2 years of the pandemic must have been really bad. We have had in 2-3 meetings that we have held since our work began in the pandemic. We've heard that often young disabled girls in rural locations did not have devices to stay online, to go to school basically, which meant that they dropped out much earlier than they would have. So it's which might also be true in urban locations, but definitely was true in rural locations. And many of the girls that we spoke to during the process of this, one of the troubles was that their family had one device, and if there was a non-disabled child, then the device was going to the non-disabled child because his or her education was more important than the education of the disabled girl. So this was something we heard from rural locations. So I think the complications of what we are saying is pretty similar for urban and rural, but I think that just understanding that rural locations have even worse access to infrastructure is important for us to think about. Yeah, I think Snehal has her hand up. I hope that answers your question, Sarah.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. So my question is that many a times a disabled she is disabled, that's why she's attracting domestic violence. Like first she's going through humiliation stage, thereafter she's going to domestic violence. I mean getting physically abused. The reason is because the person or the family people or the neighbors, they don't understand the person. Like giving her care becomes burden on them as well. So my question is it vice versa, or how we can dissect this thing?
I'm going to try to answer your question from what I understand of it. Primarily, if we imagine who does a lot of the unpaid care work in this country, it is women, right? This definitely is what we are seeing. And by unpaid care work, I mean cooking, cleaning also, but looking after the sick and the elderly also, right? So disabled people in the family then fall under this in itself. And as one of the things that data tells us is that disability and poverty are heavily present together. It could also be that in poor locations, there is difficult access to nutrition, health services are not provided for pregnant mothers, so maybe the child is born disabled. And in other ways, being disabled in this country and anywhere in the world is very, very expensive. Because your care is more expensive, your living is more expensive. So poverty then does coexist with disability in many situations. We are so in these situations, the situation is we are of course seeing that there is a lot of frustration of having to look after the disabled child, right? Or disabled adult, right? And understandably, there is frustration. But the onus comes back then on the systems that require us to provide care, right? What we are then doing at the moment, and which is a problem, is that we are placing the onus on that either that disabled child or adult to find care in whatever circumstances that are possible, or to be okay with whatever care they receive within the family, right? And our assumptions as a society is also to value the non-disabled person's time more than what it requires for us to care for a disabled person, right? It is possible, for instance, and this is true, that when we conduct trainings in sign language, it takes us double the time to do the training, because sign language interpretation takes time, right? But so does that mean we say, no, I will train whatever in 4 hours, you listen to whatever and go, right? So the accountability and onus is at the moment on individuals, right? It is not being reallocated towards systems. And as long as the accountability and onus is on an individual, there will be burden, right? But this burden cannot be translated into treating another human being badly, right? And under no circumstances will that be okay. But the reality is that that is okay. That we hear over and over, and from non-disabled family members, that my daughter or son who's disabled has no value in this world, right? When we did vaccination drive in June of last year, we saw that the entire family, everybody, June, July, August, all the family members were vaccinated except the disabled person, because I don't want to spend that 1,000 rupees on a disabled person that will never leave the house, right? And it's not so simple, because the disabled person can still contract COVID from you, and because of their disability is more vulnerable to death, to other disabling conditions accumulating, right? So I think the onus as a society, our onus is on the non-disabled person, is on a person who can contribute to society, is on somebody who can earn, on somebody who can speak nicely, who can do those things in this particular fashion, right? So, and it's in many ways, we should have similarities in our own head about how we think about women, right? She's anyway only going to get married and look after children. Why does she need to study, right? We use that logic for disabled people a lot, right? Why do I have to educate her? She's not going to go and get a job or do anything or contribute to the society. It doesn't matter. I won't waste money on this, right? So I think our perceptions of disability as something that is to be ashamed of, something that is bad, has to change. Because if you see the disabled community, we are internally laughing, right? Because if we didn't, I think we would be really depressed by all the things that are happening to us, right? And there is so much interdependence and joy in the community, but we don't see stories of this, right? And that's not because we are still struggling to look beyond the lack, look beyond this idea of a burden, right? I'm not saying that problems don't exist, they do. But I think that our perception, the lens with which we see disabled people has to completely shift. That is the only way that we will report better, that we will all in this room probably have disabled friends, that we will be able to see and witness disabled people in the ways as just diverse human nature, right? So not to just see them as one lens of missing. Yeah. So I think I'm also done.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much. A subject very close to my heart, because I have 2 disabled people in my family and they're living in disabled homes. So I'm really touched listening to you. So let me invite Dr. Sharda, please come over. She would like to say a few words.
Yeah, thank you, Malti. Thank you Leena, Vibhuti, Sameera, and Srinidhi for such very, very insightful sessions. I'm sure all the participants have learned something new today, and I hope they will use these learnings in their writings and make more sensitive and meaningful, make their reporting more sensitive and meaningful. And since this is for our fellowship selection process, we expect the participants who have been there from morning till now, I mean for the whole session, to submit storylines on any of these topics. 2 topics we have covered today and 2 more topics we are going to cover tomorrow. You can either write a series of articles on any one theme, or you can write 4 articles on all the 4 subjects. But the articles, the storylines should, the writing should be investigative and also research based, and it should have some depth, not just simple human interest stories or simple reportage. So the whole purpose of having this workshop is to give you that insight to write more meaningful and deep, more meaningful stories. So please take notes and then keep thinking of the various kinds of stories that you can pursue on the topics that we have covered. And thanks for your patience. All of you have been there for all the 3 sessions. And I know that the sessions were so good. I don't think you felt like leaving the sessions in between. And once again, a big thank you to my friends who have joined us today. They were excellent. All of you were excellent. And I hope that we continue to collaborate and then, work on creating more gender sensitivity and more sensitivity in print, in media reporting. Thank you so much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Can I ask something?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I wanted to know when do we have to submit the story ideas from today's session, and where do we send it?
I think we gave the date as 29/3.
We still haven't given the date out. We have to give them. But yes, what we decided internally was 29.
Yeah.
March 29th, right?
Yeah. 29th March, yes.
We'll be sending you a formal, note and also an application form to be filled by tomorrow once you've attended the second workshop as well.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. So let me just close with a vote of thanks. So now we are at the end of the program, and we would like to thank all of you for your enthusiasm. I would like to thank all the speakers for the day, as well as the team at Population First, and most of all, a huge note of gratitude to Dr. Sharda for her continuous support and guidance. I cannot end this program without thanking the Norwegian Embassy in New Delhi and UNFPA for their unflinching support for this edition of the fellowships as well. Thank you so much, and see you tomorrow, 2 o'clock. Thank you.
Thank you, Malti.